Hey guys, tonight we journey to a place where your taxes weren't taken in cold hard cash, but in jars of oil, loaves of bread, and the occasional basket of onions. You'll wake up on the banks of the Nile, under a sky as wide as your tax bill, and learn how an ancient civilization found a way to make bureaucracy smell nice. Literally. It's early morning, and the world feels dusty but alive. You're lying on a straw mat beneath a palm thatch awning. Your limbs are sticky from the night's heat, and your first thought isn't breakfast. It's whether you remembered to set aside enough barley to satisfy the state. Because tax season has arrived again, and the Nile's waters are whispering that the collectors won't be far behind. The river glides silently nearby, a slow ribbon of silver that's already started to retreat from its annual flood. That flood, the Aket, is both a blessing and a bureaucratic nightmare, because it signals the start of the new agricultural year, and with it, your obligations. See, you live in a time when money, as we know it, doesn't really exist. There are no shiny coins in your pocket, no stamped tokens, no crisp bills to crumple. Here, wealth lives in the form of barley, emmer wheat, honey oil, and perfume. The kind of things that are perishable, yes, but also counted, stored, and taxed like gold. You trudge to the edge of your field, rubbing your eyes. The land still smells of wet mud and last season's roots. It's quiet, just the rustle of reeds, a heron flapping low over the canal, and a few groggy farmers muttering curses at their oxen. You're not alone in your tax dread. Everyone knows what's coming, and everyone's pretending not to care. In ancient Egypt, taxes weren't just a financial burden. They were a deeply spiritual act wrapped in the language of obligation, offering, and order. The entire kingdom was built on mat, a concept of harmony, balance, and cosmic justice. Paying your dues isn't just about keeping the state running. It was about aligning yourself with the sacred rhythms of the world. That's why the Nile's flood became a built-in fiscal calendar. Its rising waters deposited thick black silt over your fields, restoring fertility and, unfortunately, reminding you that yes, you owe someone for that miracle. Historians still argue whether the earliest forms of Egyptian taxation were truly standardized, or more like vaguely coercive requests, enforced with a polite threat of jail. What we do know is that by the time of the Middle Kingdom, around 2000 BCE, taxes were organized enough to make your head spin. There were entire departments dedicated to collection and inspection, and unlike modern tax forms, you couldn't just lie and say your dog ate your barley. Scribes, those sly, ink-fingered administrators of the Nile, had ways of knowing. They kept records on papyrus scrolls, stone stiles, and even the walls of tombs. There are surviving inscriptions listing exactly how much wheat a farmer owed, how much perfume a village contributed, and which unlucky souls were behind on their fish deliveries. Yes, fish, also taxable. You begin your morning by inspecting your own modest stash: a basket of millet, a few clay jugs sealed with wax, and a loaf of honey bread so fragrant it'd qualify as a dessert bribe. But it's not a gift, it's a requirement. Your neighbor appears, wiping sweat from his brow with a rag that smells suspiciously like sandalwood. Think they'll take perfume this year, he grumbles, nodding toward the tax trail winding along the rive bank. Perfume, it turns out, was one of the kingdom's most versatile currencies. With recipes guarded like family heirlooms, perfumers produced scented oils for religious rituals, royal use, and, you guessed it, paying off one's civic duty. A small vial of mirror oil count toward your tax burden, especially if you didn't have enough grain to cover the bill. And wasn't just the government that accepted it. Temples collected taxes too, on behalf of the gods. Some scholars believe the temples were essentially the kingdom's largest banks. When you offered goods to the gods, those goods didn't just vanish in a puff of incense. They were cataloged, stored, and, often, reused. So when you handed over that fine roll of linen, or a tiny alabaster jar of rose oil, the priest would murmur a prayer and quietly pass it to the back room for inventory. The wind shifts, bringing the scent of silt, wood smoke, and date palms. The tax collectors are on the move. They travel in groups, usually with a scribe in front, 2 assistants behind, and a donkey or 2 loaded with blank scrolls, measuring cords, and just enough muscle to back up their authority. No spears, no yelling, just a kind of bureaucratic menace that's worse than armed conflict, the threat of endless paperwork. You watch as your neighbor disappears down the road, muttering, hope they don't ask about last year's onions. You will, of course, forget to mention the 3 jugs of beer you sold on the side to a passing boatman. You'll hide one of your better loves behind the reed mat, and hope they don't ask to see the oven. Because the real secret of ancient Egyptian tax life, everyone was faking it a little, and everyone, especially the scribes, knew. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You follow the dusty road southward, your arms full of offerings, though calling them offerings is your way of making this feel more spiritual than it is. Let's be honest, Stag, this is more tax day than temple day. The mud bricks of your village fade behind you as you walk past sleepy goats, a boy chasing a frog, and two older women haggling over a bunch of leeks. Ahead, there's a checkpoint of sorts, not a guard post, not exactly, just a reed canopy, some rope, and a makeshift table set up under a palm tree. Behind it, 3 men and a woman, all of them dressed in slightly cleaner lining than you, which is its own kind of warning sign. Scribes. The woman dips her reed pen into a little inkwell made from a hollowed fig. She doesn't even look up as she speaks. Name, you tell her. She scribbles. Occupation. You tell her that too, though. Grows stuff and sometimes makes soup. Isn't exactly an official category. She nods anyway. And then comes the part everyone dreads. She gestures to the man beside her, who stands, pulls out a thick cord of knotted rope, and starts walking toward your field. Yep, time for a surprise audit. Historians still argue whether these inspections were random, scheduled, or just conveniently arranged when a scribe needed to make quota. What's clear is that your land will now be measured, a word that makes your stomach turn, because when they say measured, they mean assessed for maximum possible extraction. The rope trick is simple. They use a knotted cord to calculate distance, each knot spaced at a royal cubit, about 52 centimeters. The man trails it behind him like a bored fisherman, calling out numbers as he steps over weeds and irrigation ditches. A second scribe jots it all down with maddening calm. 200 cubits by 70. Good flood coverage. Wheat density. High. And that's how they do it. Your field's productivity becomes a matter of official record, that you also lost half your onions to a rogue ibex last month. Not relevant. It all goes into a massive centralized ledger, sometimes literally carved into stone. Egypt had bureaucratic stonecutters. Think about that. Somewhere out there is a tablet listing your cousin's fig inventory from 1850 BCE, and it's survived longer than your cousin's name. Back at the checkpoint, the woman is still scribbling. She asks what you've brought. You show her a wax-sealed jar of lotus oil, 3 loaves of barley bread, 2 rolls of coarse linen, and a small pouch of natron. Good for soap, mummification, or scrubbing tax documents clean of embarrassing entries. She raises an eyebrow. No honey. You try not to flinch. Honey was a luxury tax item, sometimes worth more than its weight in silver. That makes it both valuable and suspicious. People don't just hand over honey unless they're either fabulously successful or terribly desperate. I used it all, you say. She smirks. Sure. There's a popular saying in the villages, you can't sweeten the tax roll with silence. It basically means, if you don't say anything, they'll assume the worst. So you mumble something about the bees migrating early. She writes it down. Of course she does. As annoying as it all feels, it's not technically new. Egypt's tax system has been around in some form since the First Dynasty, more than 1,000 years before the pyramids were even an idea. By the New Kingdom era, there were specific taxes for farmland, livestock, beehives, fishing boats, and even households with more than one adult male. Scribes kept records not just for taxation, but also for religious offerings, legal disputes, and labor assignments. There are entire tomb walls covered in administrative records. Who worked where, who showed up late, who brought too little oil. Imagine being immortalized for underpaying your perfume tax. You glance at your fellow villagers, most of them trying not to make eye contact with the officials. The smart ones come bearing little gifts, an extra loaf, a folded cloth, a flattering comment. It's not bribery, not officially, just efficient manners. One man drops his basket and out tumbles a small alabaster jar. The scent of jasmine oil fills the air. The scribes all stop for a second. That's top shelf stuff. Jasmine had to be cultivated carefully, and its oil was pressed with stone rollers and blended with moringa base in a process that took weeks. It's rumored that high priests bathed in it before entering temple sanctuaries. Nice. One of the assistants mutters. Perfume, in all its forms, was a major part of Egypt's trade economy. The country exported fragrant oils to Crete, Byblos, and even farther afield, and the state took its cut, not through tariffs, mind you, through collection. Local producers were often required to hand over a share to the temple or palace. If you happened to be a perfumer, you were taxed in cent. There's still debate over how much of Egypt's economy was centrally controlled. Some scholars argue that despite appearances, the system allowed for a surprising amount of local autonomy. 3 days ago. Others suggest that the bureaucratic grip was as tight as a priest's handshake. Either way, you know one thing, you'll never smell lotus oil again without thinking of this checkpoint. The woman waves you forward. You're cleared. Next. You walk past the rope barrier, your arms lighter but your brain buzzing. You've paid. Or at least, you've paid enough. Behind you, someone starts arguing about the quality of their onions. The scribe sighs and reaches for another scroll. You don't look back. You've survived another year. Sort of. You step off the main path and let your feet wander along the canal's edge, just far enough to avoid the next crowd of anxious taxpayers. There's something about the sound of water lapping softly against mud banks that quiets the hum of panic in your skull. You've paid your dues. For now. And maybe tomorrow you'll regret parting with your last decent bread roll, but tonight, you're still upright, and nobody confiscated your donkey. That counts for something. As you walk, the smell of wet earth and date palms thickens. Somewhere nearby, a fisherman is singing off-key to the Nile, his reed boat bobbing in lazy rhythm. And beyond him, yes, there it is again. That faint trail of incense smoke curling above a government granary. Granaries in Egypt weren't just dusty silos stacked with wheat, they were the beating heart of the state's economic machinery. Temples managed their own grain stores, but the royal administration operated massive complexes, walled compounds with scribes, overseers, guards, and a terrifying number of ledgers. Here's the part that always confuses modern minds. Egypt didn't use coins for most of its history. No jingling pockets, no copper clinking. Taxes weren't paid in money but goods: wheat, barley, papyrus cattle, beer, and, for the lucky ones, perfume. The temple granary doesn't look like much from the outside. Just low mud, brick buildings that blend into the horizon. But inside, it's a different story. Carefully partitioned silos hold tribute grain, all sorted by region and quality. The best wheat from Elephantine might be in one chamber, while low-grade barley from a drought-struck village sulks in another. You once overheard a scribe describe it like this: "It's not just bread, it's bureaucracy in edible form." And he wasn't wrong. The real genius of the Egyptian tax system lies in its consistency. Every harvest season, known as Shimu, citizens were expected to contribute a portion of their yield. The exact fraction, that depended. Sometimes it was a flat 10%, other times more, especially if the Nile flooded generously that year. Which sounds great, until you realize a bumper crop means a bumper tax bill. Historians still argue whether those rates were truly fair or if the scribes played fast and loose depending on who brought the nicest beer. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Now, here's where it gets a little weird, because Egypt didn't just store goods for future use, it used them like currency. Let's say the temple needed a new bricklayer. They might pay him in wheat pulled from the granary. That same wheat had once been your tax. Your barley bread becomes someone else's paycheck. It's like being part of a barter network you never agreed to join. You reach the granary gates, where two priests are arguing about a shipment of leeks. The younger one insists they smell questionable, while the older mutters something about how leeks always smell like regret. You sidestep them gently and glance at the stone tally board nailed beside the entrance. Your village is listed under its the Egyptian word for district. The scribes have etched marks beside each village name, noting amounts received. You spot yours. One small lotus beside it. A perfume icon. That's you. Lotus oil was one of Egypt's most prized exports, not just because it smelled divine, but because it lasted. Unlike many floral oils, it didn't spoil quickly in the heat, especially when sealed in carved alabaster jars. You once saw a trader exchange a single bottle for a cartload of dried fish and 2 bolts of dyed linen. It wasn't just a luxury, it was leverage, and perfume had ceremonial value too. Temples burned scented oils during rituals. Priests anointed statues with it. Even the dead were sometimes buried with vials of it, in case the afterlife was musty. There's a fringe theory among some scholars that perfume taxes were designed not just for economy, but for ritual control. That by managing who had access to scent, the priesthood reinforced a kind of social order. Sounds dramatic, sure, but this is Egypt. They once had a festival where you carried a god statue through town on a boat full of beer. Subtlety isn't their strong suit. You leave the granary gates behind, heading toward the edge of the administrative quarter. Around you, the streets are thinning out, and the lanterns glow lower. But you can't help noticing something. Those who paid in perfume seem to carry themselves differently. Maybe it's the lack of floor dust in their hair, or the faint aura of rosewood clinging to their linen. Perfume payers were often artisans, priestesses, or household workers from noble estates. Not rich, exactly, but connected. Who people dealt in scents weren't scraping together barley or begging for leniency on cattle taxes. They had skills, recipes, insider knowledge of how long to steep henna root for the best floral undertones. There's an old recipe you once learned from your grandmother. Crushed myrrh, soaked cedar chips, boiled cinnamon bark, all bound in honey and aged in clay. She claimed it was used in palace rituals. You tried making it once. The house smelled like burned pudding for a week, and your cousin got stung by a bee that mistook the mix for an actual flower. Still, you've gotten better since then, and thanks to a bit of luck, and a patch of wild blutas growing near the canal, you've become the oil person for your area. Not quite famous, not quite forgotten. The moon rises above the city walls as you head home, empty jars clinking gently at your side. You've paid your taxes with scent and bread, yes, but in doing so, you've also staked your place in a system that, for all its absurdities, runs on rhythm, like the Nile, like the stars, like your grandmother's oil, steeping quietly in a dark jar, awaiting for the next offering. You wake the next morning to the soft shuffle of reeds brushing against your window slats. The breeze is thick with Nile mist, and somewhere in the distance, A heron complains loudly about its breakfast. You stretch under your linen sheet, aware that your jars are emptier than your stomach, but also that you don't have a tax collector banging on the door. For today, at least, you're free. As the sun climbs, you head out toward the market, where the real flavor of Egypt pulses, figuratively and literally. It's here that taxes ripple back into circulation. Because once you've paid your dues in perfume and bread, that same bread ends up sold, traded, or baked into someone else's breakfast. Welcome to the strange economics of a barter-based empire. The air is already thick with scent, crushed coriander, smoked fish, unwashed linen, and sweet dates melting on hot mats. Markets in Egypt aren't tidy rows of booths, they're organized chaos. Merchants squatting on blankets, noblewomen inspecting baskets with suspicion, goats chewing scrolls unattended, and always a child running where no child should be. You duck under a stall strung with garlic, narrowly avoiding a papyrus scroll fluttering into a fish sauce vat. Beside you, a man mutters curses in Coptic, though, historically, that's not entirely accurate. Historians still debate which languages were actually spoken in daily life depending on time and region. Old Egyptian, Late Egyptian, Demotic, maybe even early Greek among the elite. The modern word Coptic didn't really show up until later. But let's not interrupt the man, he's already knee-deep in fermented eel. You make your way to the bakers. Their ovens are like small furnaces carved into the earth, radiating the kind of heat that makes your eyelashes feel too close to your face. The bread they produce is dark, coarse, and pyramid-shaped, kolta. Not pyramid, shaped like a novelty tourist trinket, mind you, just vaguely pointy, because it was baked against the walls of clay molds. If you squint, it looks more like a sad mountain than a sacred tomb. But it's filling, dense, hard enough to chip a molar if stale. You're here to trade, not buy. And because you paid in perfume yesterday, today you're flush with leftover favors. A neighbor owes you 3 loaves. Another promised a jar of date syrup for the jar of blue lotus you slipped them before tax day. It's a web of reciprocal debt, scented with cardamom and casual resentment. One baker slides you a loaf so fresh it steams. For the oil last week, she says, not meeting your eyes, then adds quickly, don't ask how I got the cinnamon. You don't, it's better that way. The truth is, taxes in ancient Egypt weren't just obligations, they were social glue. What you gave the state became leverage in the community. If you were generous, you gained status. If you tried to cheat the system, people noticed. There's even an old ostrakon, a pottery shard with writing on it, where a scribe complains that his neighbor pretends not to have goats, but the goats keep shouting. That's the thing about goat-based tax evasion, it's not exactly subtle. Scholars still argue whether Egypt's system was more about collecting goods or controlling behavior. Some say it was an economic model ahead of its time, a sustainable network based on redistributive justice. Others argue it was a glorified racket wrapped in papyrus. The answer, as usual, floats somewhere in the middle, like a half-sunk papyrus canoe drifting through a marsh. You find yourself at the perfumer's corner, where the real drama usually happens. Here, scent is currency and competition is fierce. One man is hawking a blend he claims will make you irresistible to the gods. Another swears his rose oil has healing powers, though his last customer sneezed for 6 hours straight. You nod politely and keep walking. You spot an old woman crouched behind a pyramid of tiny alabaster jars. She nods once, doesn't speak. You know her blends, subtle, clean, a mix of almond oil, lotus, and something you've never identified, but always reminds you of warm straw at dusk. You trade her a baked fish and a gossip tidbit about a priest's nephew caught skinny, dipping in the irrigation canal. She gives you a half-filled jar and a wink. In this part of the city, taxes are stories, favors scents. They travel more than people do. It's tempting to think of all this as chaos, but it isn't. It's soft infrastructure, rules written in social norms instead of stone. Everybody knows you pay after harvest. Everybody knows what happens if you don't. And everybody, including the overseers, pretends not to see the little workarounds that keep everyone alive. You pass a scribe scratching notes onto a tablet, his reed pen tapping like an impatient beetle. He's logging who brought what, who missed their quota, who tried to sneak barley by pretending it was Emma wheat. It's a losing game. Emma is bulkier and twice as annoying to mill. Even blindfolded, a granary clerk could tell. Still, you admire the effort. You stroll past a young boy hawking honey-soaked cakes, using the ancient marketing technique known as shouting at people until they buy something. You give him a copper fish hook in exchange for 2 cakes. Not official currency, but valuable enough in a world where the Nile coughs up dinner, and you don't want to do it with your bare hands. Everything here is exchange. Everything here is layered. And yet, it all stems from that moment yesterday, when you handed over your perfume jar, and the temple clerk nodded without asking your name. That tiny nod echoed outward, into loaves, into oil, into cakes. You bite into one now. It's absurdly sweet, and you can't help smiling. Tomorrow, the tax scribes may raise the quotas. They may decide your perfume isn't fragrant enough, or declare your garden too lush, and assume it means hidden income. But today your bread is soft, your oil is traded, and your status, if temporarily, smells like rose petals and baked honey. By mid-afternoon, the market heat clings to your skin like a second tunic. Your sandals squelch in a patch of questionable origin, somewhere between spilt fish brine and an overripe pomegranate, and you begin your slow retreat back home, hands sticky with honey cake, arms loaded with oddments traded in lieu of silver. You have no coin, but you do have 2 loaves, half a jar of lotus balm, and an onion the size of your ego. And that, in this economy, makes you practically royalty. You take a side path shaded by palm fronds, and soon you're passing one of the temples that double as administrative centers. It's massive, cool in its shadows, and faintly echoing with the rhythmic hum of scribes at work, reeds scratching papyrus, sandals pacing stone, the occasional cough of someone trying to stay awake while calculating bread taxes for a village with 1 goat and 17 opinions. It's here that much of Egypt's economic muscle gets flexed. You might imagine temples as purely spiritual places, but in truth, they were also the bureaucratic biceps of the state. Their priests were not only spiritual guides but also tax officials, granary managers, and budget officers, though with a lot more eyeliner than your average accountant. Inside, rows of scribes sit with wax tablets and bundles of records. You're not here on business today, just curiosity. But it's a good place to observe how your perfume becomes paperwork. A man in a leopard skin robe. Not real leopard, don't panic. It's symbolic, pivots between 2 stone cubicles muttering about miscounted onions. He gestures for a younger clerk to weigh a jar of honey. "This is not a full deben," he says, indignantly. A deben being the weight standard of the time, roughly 90 grams, though historians still argue whether the weight varied depending on region or commodity. The answer is, as always probably, you catch sight of a tax ledger, its surface dark with ink strokes, names, villages, quantities. It's beautiful in a terrifying way, like watching your bank balance drop in hieroglyphics. Scribes held enormous power in ancient Egypt. They were among the few who could read and write, which meant they were the ones recording how much grain you owed, how many jars of oil you'd delivered, and whether your donkey was considered taxable. Yes, your donkey. Animal taxes were a thing. Cows, goats, ducks, you name it, someone tried to tax it. You remember a local legend about a farmer who tried to disguise his prized ox as a very large dog to avoid livestock dues. The story ended, predictably, with a fine, a broken fence, and one very annoyed ox. It's unclear whether the tale is true, but scribes love to write down these little moral stories, often with phrases like, "Let this be a warning," as if future tax dodgers would somehow read them and think, yes, best not disguise my camel as a hay bale. There's a noise behind you. 2 women in linen head wraps arguing over how much barley their neighbor really harvested this season. Ears are everywhere in temple districts, especially when the tax season peaks, which it often did after the harvest, in what's now roughly November. The Nile's annual flood had receded by then, leaving black, silty earth so fertile it practically begged to be planted, and from that moment everything grew. Wheat, flax, papyrus, and of course, your obligation to the state. You don't just grow crops in Egypt, you grow taxes. Historians still debate whether this system was efficient or oppressive. Some argue it provided essential redistributive infrastructure. Others see it as a top-heavy theocratic squeeze. But from your position here, sweaty and clutching an onion, it's just Tuesday. You wander past a statue of Thoth, the ibis, headed god of wisdom and writing. You silently thank him for the scribes who spelled your name correctly last time. A rare luxury. There's a broken shard on the temple floor where someone has angrily scratched out their name and rewritten it 3 times, followed by what looks suspiciously like a curse. At the far end of the hall is a small courtyard where offerings are collected. Not spiritual ones, tax ones. Jars of beer, bundles of flax, baskets of cucumbers, all labelled with the names of the villagers who brought them. Some even have little notes attached, trying to sweeten the mood of the collection clerk. "From my humble house to the great temple," reads one, scrawled in shaky hieratic. Another simply says, "Sorry, it's late. The cow got sick." You chuckle and wonder how many excuses temple officials heard in a day. One scholar wrote that an entire town once claimed their bread went missing in a mysterious boat accident. No witnesses. Just a very full crocodile nearby, and an equally full priest suspiciously licking crumbs off his fingers. You run your hand along the cool stone wall as you exit, feeling the carved grooves of centuries-old lists. Everything recorded, nothing forgotten. And all of it, from the fish sauce to the flour oils to the fabled missing bread, flowing in and out of these stone courtyards like a giant, perfumed accounting machine. Outside, the sun blinds you briefly, and you squint toward the granary in the distance. That's where much of the collected grain goes, sealed, tall, circular silos with steep sides and narrow tops. Makes it harder for accidental spillage, if you catch the drift. Sometimes those granaries are guarded by cats. Not guards with cats, literal cats. Worshipped and practical. They keep rats from munching away your hard-earned tribute. A purring tax enforcement squad, if you will. You pass a small shrine tucked behind a palm tree, where someone's left a dried fig and a sprig of henna. You're not sure if it's meant for the gods, the scribes, or just a particularly beloved tax collector. But you pause anyway, setting down your onion, just in case. The next morning, you're woken not by the sun or birdsong, but by the high-pitched shriek of a neighbor discovering her grain jar lighter than expected. Someone's been skimming. Again. Possibly a teenager with a grudge, possibly a hungry goat with ambition. Either way, she's not quiet about it. You roll over, stretch, and contemplate the reality of living in a world where your pantry isn't just your survival, it's your spreadsheet. In ancient Egypt, taxes weren't something you filed once a year with a sigh and a cup of stale coffee. They were an ongoing, physical reality, measured in sacks, not statements. As you shuffle outside, the morning air still cool against your skin, you notice the telltale signs of tax day preparation. Baskets being woven tight, lids double, checked, donkeys tied up with awkwardly balanced bundles. It's all about appearances. Your offerings, whether grain, linen, oil, or that particularly pungent garlic paste, need to look presentable. You're not just paying dues, you're performing economic diplomacy. You nod at an elderly man rubbing flour oil into a clay jug, muttering something about making it shine like a god's bald head. You're not sure if that's an expression or a very specific compliment. Either way, it smells good. Today, you're accompanying a neighbor to the tax outpost, an extension of the temple, but less imposing and more chaotic. Think bureaucratic village fair. The kind where people argue over whether their cumin was weighed on a crooked scale, and someone inevitably tries to bribe the clerk with a goose that isn't theirs. The outpost sits near the irrigation canal, surrounded by mud brick buildings and ringed with scribes, collectors, guards, and onlookers who pretend they're just passing through, but are definitely there for the drama. You walk in behind your neighbor, who is now suspiciously quiet and holding her basket of onions like a nervous bride. The collector this week is a lanky man with a nose that could slice bread and an attitude that suggests he's been disappointed in humanity since birth. He sniffs each offering like it personally offended him. Smells adequate. He mutters of your neighbor's onions, jotting something in a ledger. Next, or your turn. You present a jar of henna paste and 2 small linen wraps scented with myrrh. Not exactly the riches of the Nile, but respectable. He takes a long look at you, a longer look at the paste, and then says, "Where did you get this myrrh?" "Nubian blend." "Possibly." You reply vaguely, suddenly unsure whether that's good or bad. He gives a short grunt and gestures for the scribe. "Mark it 2 measures henna, 2 perfumed linens, possibly Nubian." The scribe writes it down with a flourish, as if adding mystery enhances the record. Historians still argue whether tax assessments were based strictly on production, or if there was wiggle room for negotiation. From where you stand, next to a man loudly insisting his flax was stolen by spirits. It's clearly both science and art. There's even an informal hierarchy of goods. Grain was the gold standard, but perfume, honey, dried fish, spices, and textiles were all viable currencies. The trick was consistency. The state didn't want a jar of cinnamon one year and a duck's foot the next. Predictability greased the wheels. You glance around and spot a family unrolling a bolt of linen with embroidered falcons along the edge. A small crowd gathers. Embroidery gets attention. It suggests either wealth or ambition, and possibly both. Of course, embroidered offerings can backfire. Once, a young man gifted a fabric featuring a winged sun disk and was accused of impersonating royal iconography. That did not end in applause. Back at your line, a scribe politely asks your name again. You spell it slowly, trying to ignore the 4 different ways he writes the first syllable. You suspect that one of those might be an insult. Hard to say. A child runs past carrying a chicken, chased by a woman shouting about ritual offerings. And you don't even like poultry. It's unclear if the child or the gods are being addressed. Either way, the chicken's having a great day. The scene might feel chaotic, but there's a rhythm here. The goods flow in, the records are made, the tallies adjusted. Somewhere, deep in a cool archive, a master list is being updated. How much linen came from each district? How many jars of oil? How many baskets of fruit? It's a living system, oiled by labor, scent, sweat, and soft bribes. There's even a tax for temple maintenance. It's not always labeled as such, but donations are expected. After all, someone has to repaint those wall reliefs every few decades, and the gods aren't exactly picking up the brush themselves. You wander over to the side area where rejected offerings are stacked. A cracked jar of beer, some wilted herbs, a suspiciously empty basket. You wonder how many of these rejections are based on quality, and how many on grudges. You remember a story you once heard from an old grain measurer one year. A collector refused a basket of lotus seeds from a woman who, rumor said, had mocked his sandals. The official reason was, seed inconsistency, which somehow sounds both vague and deeply judgmental. Before you leave, you spot a carved wooden sign near the clerk's desk. It reads, "Give fairly, receive peace." The last word is scratched over with what looks like maybe. You and your neighbor exit the outpost with a mixture of relief and confusion. You're lighter in goods but slightly heavier in knowledge, namely, that temple clerks can smell fake cinnamon from 10 paces, and that some tax disputes end with more shouting than logic. Back in the sunshine, your neighbor sighs. "At least it's done for another cycle," she says, wiping her brow. Then, with a pause, "Unless the flood changes again, then we reassess." Again, you nod. Because that's the rule here. The Nile rises, the taxes follow. Whether in barley or balsam, everything feeds the same machine. And you just try to stay on its good side, and maybe keep a backup onion or two. You wake the next day to the familiar thrum of sandals against dust, the sound of someone pacing outside your home, muttering under their breath. It's the local grain counter, again. He's always mumbling about flood charts and phantom bushels. His papyrus scrolls flap in the breeze like laundry, and his ink-stained fingers twitch with the stress of 1,000 missing sheaves. Today, you've been summoned for reassessment. Apparently, there's a discrepancy in your field's yield compared to the flood level from 3 seasons ago. Yes, 3. Nile tax math is less about what you grew yesterday and more about the mystical geometry of ancient silt deposits. You sigh, wrap a light line and shawl over your shoulder, and step into the baking light. Welcome to the agricultural tax cycle, a divine guessing game run by mortal bureaucrats. Historians still argue whether the Nile flood taxes were calculated with genuine precision or more of an educated estimate. You suspect the truth lies somewhere between careful measurement and rolling a set of astrogoli bones while praying no one double checks your math. The grain counter greets you with a tight nod and gestures toward a nearby plot of land. Your land. It's dusty now, dry and cracked like a dropped pot, but months ago it was shimmering with green, and that memory of what it once was is now being dissected. 2.5 auroras, he murmurs, referencing the ancient unit of land. Yield was low, but your neighbor's was higher. Same floodplain. Curious. You open your mouth to explain that your neighbor bribed his oxen with beer, and they plowed like possessed beasts. But the grain counter isn't interested in gossip. He's interested in ratios, flood logs, and whispering things to his abacus. Grain was the lifeblood of the economy. You didn't just eat it. You paid with it, saved it, exchanged it. It filled granaries like coins in a vault, with scribes perched nearby guarding every kernel like greedy pigeons. And when harvest season ended, the measuring began. At the peak of taxation, field workers would carry their grain to central depots, long mud-brick buildings cooled by shaded alcoves. Inside, scribes sat at low tables stacked with ledgers. Officials weighed the offerings with balanced scales using stone or metal weights that had, allegedly, been standardized, though some looked suspiciously polished, as if their weight changed depending on who held them. 80% for the state, the grain counter mutters now, eyes on his scroll. 20 for you. Unless it's a temple field. Then it's different. Slightly. You resist the urge to say something sarcastic about slightly. In some districts, temple-owned lands had tax privileges, so odd they seemed made up. In others, workers on royal lands were exempt, but expected to give up their children for labor service instead. It was a bit of a lose-lose unless you had divine favor, or a cousin in the ministry of cows. As you walk together back toward the collection point, the grain counter tells you, apropos of nothing, about a case last season where a family tried to hide part of their yield by burying it in sealed pottery beneath their home. Unfortunately, the pottery cracked, and their house ended up infested with rats fat enough to pay their own taxes. You nod politely. He seems pleased. At the depot, you spot a scribe you've dealt with before, a woman with sharp eyes and an elegant braid. She's scribbling notes on a new set of harvest records with the calm precision of someone who could recite tax law backwards in her sleep. You recognize a few neighbors in line. One is clutching a small basket of lentils with the desperate hope of a last-minute substitution. Another is holding a jug of honey close to her chest, as if she fears it might be judged too floral. There's a rumor that some tax scribes have scent preferences, and while no one will admit it, more than one farmer has added crushed mint leaves to their offerings, just in case. The woman scribe looks up and smiles faintly. 2.5 auroras. Second planting. Show me. You lift the folded cloth that covers your jars. Inside are neat bundles of barley, still dusted with flour, plus one small brick of date, paste you're using as a goodwill gesture. You know it's not required, but sometimes gestures go further than grain. She inspects each item with the calm detachment of a cat sniffing a new cushion. Then she scribbles your name down in 3 columns. What was expected, what was received, and what can't be explained, but was still accepted because, frankly, it smelled too good to argue. Here's the thing they never told you as a child: paying taxes in ancient Egypt was less about strict enforcement and more about social rhythm. Everyone knew the dance. The state took what it needed, the people gave what they could, and sometimes the gods were bribed with pomegranates just to look the other way. You make your final mark on the scribe's ledger, a thumbprint pressed into wet clay, and step back, your basket light and your stomach growling. As you leave, the grain counter mutters to himself again, this time about inconsistencies in olive oil viscosity between districts. You're tempted to point out that maybe olives don't like being compared across floodplains, but you decide against it. Some truths are too spicy for morning conversation. Instead, you head back home, passing a cart piled high with sesame and dried figs, overhearing two old men arguing over whether papyrus counts as an audible offering. One insists yes, if boiled enough. You smile, because in the land of taxes paid in bread and perfume, logic takes a back seat to tradition, and survival means knowing when to speak, when to measure, and when to slip an extra date into your ledger for good luck. By the time the midday sun blazes high over your village, you've already given away most of your grain, half your patience, and all your bargaining figs. Your stomach complains like a lazy crocodile, and the hem of your linen tunic sticks stubbornly to your knees. But today's far from over, because what you owe in grain is only half the equation. Taxes weren't just a once-a-year thing. No, they slithered into every part of life, like sand in your sandals. Which brings us to the other half of your civic duty, corvée labor. This time, it's brick hauling. You knew it was coming. Everyone gets called up eventually, unless you're wealthy enough to pay someone else to go in your place. And you, dear taxpayer, are wealthy only in mosquito bites and sarcasm. So, here you are, shoulder to shoulder with a dozen other villagers in a long line at the edge of a construction site, staring at a pit of mud with a look of shared betrayal. There's a supervisor in leopard-patterned linen, which probably cost more than your entire house. He's chewing something that might be lotus root, or just very stale gum, and he calls your name in that flat, unimpressed tone reserved for tax labourers and wayward donkeys. Carry bricks. Don't drop them. You nod solemnly, though in your head you add, and don't fall into the kiln again, remembering the poor soul who misjudged a slippery ramp, and became a cautionary tale that now has its own song. Corvée labour was the tax you paid with your body. Officially, it was for public works, granaries, canals, temples. Unofficially, it was also for whatever project the local governor thought would look nice on a future tum wall. Historians still argue whether this labour system was largely voluntary, semi-coerced, or one blink away from being just a fancier name for state, enforced servitude. Probably all three, depending on your job and who your cousin was married to. You're handed a rope, tied pack of mud bricks still warm from drying, and your arms sink under the weight. This isn't the kind of job that makes you stronger. It just compresses you into a shorter, dustier version of yourself. The site you're working on is a granary wall, a long, curved structure meant to store thousands of sacks of wheat and barley. It smells like hay, baked clay, and vague suffering. Scribes watch the labourers from a shaded platform, occasionally writing things down and occasionally napping. The woman next to you mutters under her breath about her feet swelling like overripe dates. You sympathise. At midday, someone hands out flat loaves of emmer bread and tiny lumps of preserved fish. It's the kind of meal that tastes better if you imagine you're someone else, maybe a noble reclining in a perfumed room, eating from golden plates. But the bread is dry, and the fish is suspiciously chewy. You chew anyway. Work resumes. The sun presses down like a judgment. Your skin glistens with sweat and dust, turning you the colour of spiced lentils. A child labourer drops a brick, narrowly missing a goat, and is rewarded with a lecture about discipline and divine order. You mentally assign the goat a promotion. At some point, someone starts humming a temple hymn twisted into a work song. The lyrics have been altered to include complaints about the bucket with the hole and Supervisor Breadface. It's strangely uplifting. You pause during a water break to chat with an older worker named Mena, who claims to have been doing corvée for 20 years. It's not so bad, he says, chewing dried dates. At least you're not in charge of counting bricks. That job'll age your soul. He tells you about a man in Memphis who paid his entire labour tax in perfume instead. Jars of kyphi and lotus oil. His sister made it, Mena explains. Apparently so potent, the scribes accepted it without a single question. This, of course, leads to a lively debate among the workers about which alternative tax payments are most effective. Honey? Risky. It spoils. Beer? Always welcome. Ostrich feathers? Only if you're bribing someone in Thebes. You've heard of others' scented oils, embroidered linen, even medicinal herbs like frankincense. One woman once offered a carved amulet shaped like the Eye of Horus, claiming it would keep tax spirits away. No one was sure if it worked, but it did disappear from the record. So yes, while corvée labour was the default for those without specialty goods, clever taxpayers often found ways to sweeten the obligation. Some districts, especially those close to temples, had surprisingly detailed ledgers for non-grain offerings. There are scrolls that mention taxes paid in goose eggs, baskets of cucumbers, and once, an entire baked ox leg delivered with a decorative garnish. You can't make this up. Well, you could, but why bother? The sun begins to sink, and the shadows stretch long and thin like lazy cats. The supervisor finally waves a dismissive hand. Work for the day is done. You drop the last brick with theatrical flair and roll your shoulders. They pop like old roof beams. As you trudge home, the sky blushes with sunset, and the air smells faintly of wood smoke and baked bread. There's still dust in your ears, and probably between your teeth, but the worst of it is over. For now. You pass a boy walking the other way with a jar of honey cradled in his arms like a newborn. He looks terrified and proud. Paying tax? You ask. He nods solemnly. For my father. You give him a small, tired salute and keep walking. After all, in Egypt, taxes weren't just a civic duty. They were a family affair, a divine expectation, and occasionally, an olfactory adventure. And as you finally reach your doorway, too tired to even swat at the mosquito buzzing your ear, you realize you've just survived another day in the glorious bureaucracy of the Nile. Morning drapes itself over the Nile like a soft linen sheet, golden and quiet, until the shouting starts. You wake to the sound of your neighbor arguing with a tax scribe, something about miscounted lentils. You're not surprised. You've learned by now that in Egypt, math isn't just math, it's politics in disguise. Today is collection day in your district. That means long lines, tired animals, and arguments over how many jars of oil count as a reasonable offering. You rub the sleep from your eyes and stretch slowly, careful not to aggravate the sore spots from yesterday's brick hauling. If your joints could talk, they'd ask for hazard pay. As you step outside, the streets are already alive with carts creaking under sacks of barley, fishermen hauling up strings of salted tilapia, and perfumers gently cradling clay jars like they're holding a heartbeat. Everyone has something to offer, some payment to deliver in kind, because here, taxes don't clink in coins. They squish, they slosh, they smell like dried onions. This week, you're bringing scented oil. Not yours. Your cousin makes it. Technically illegal to swap labor for goods without registering it first, but everyone does it. You shrug and sling the basket over your shoulder. It's filled with amphorae sealed in wax and wrapped in palm fiber. As you join the winding line outside the scribes' building, the smells are, let's call them robust. The man in front of you is offering dried leeks. Behind you, someone brought live pigeons in a reed cage, and they do not appreciate being tax deductible. At the front, the scribes sit beneath a papyrus awning, robes crisp, expressions blank. One scribbles quickly as offerings are presented. Another lifts lids and sniffs them with an alarming intensity, like a wine critic at a discount vineyard. Name, the scribe asks the man with the leeks. Horemheb, son of Seti, offering. 3 sacks dried leeks, 1 jar fig wine. Half of a goat, half, the good half. The scribe doesn't even blink, just nods and scratches something onto his papyrus scroll. You chuckle to yourself, but keep your face neutral. Scribes are like crocodiles, hard to read, easily offended, and technically sacred. When it's your turn, you step forward and gently place the oil jars on the woven mat. The scribe leans over and breaks the wax seal with a copper tool. A thin spiral of fragrance lifts into the air. Lotus, a hint of cinnamon, and something else, perhaps frankincense. He sniffs, pauses, then nods once, eyes still half-lidded. This will cover your household's grain quota, he says, scribbling quickly. You owe 2 days' labor next month. Road repair duty. You sigh. Could be worse. Could be canal dredging. Or, shudder, letter and excavation. Behind you, the pigeon man is arguing. These birds are sacred. They're underweight. They coo in the presence of Rao. They also poop in the presence of scribes. Rejected. You step away before it turns into a full squabble. As you leave the queue, your cousin pops out from under a tamarisk tree grinning. They accepted the oil. They did. You've got the nose of a goddess. She beams. Don't tell them that. I might get taxed for it. Historians still argue whether tax collectors in ancient Egypt were mainly religious functionaries, bureaucrats, or local power brokers playing at both. In truth, they were probably all three, depending on who paid them best. Records show the variety of goods accepted was astonishing. Jars of date syrup, bundles of dyed flax, even scorpion venom, carefully stored in tiny ceramic vials and presumably collected by someone with no plans for a long life. There's a famous tale, maybe true, maybe not, of a farmer near Asyut who tried to pay his taxes in laughter. He showed up with a puppet show, jokes, and a trained monkey who did flips. The scribe was not amused, but the monkey bit him, so at least someone got satisfaction. You pass a nearby stall where a potter is arranging his wares, delicate oil lamps shaped like ibises. He nods at you. They take pottery today. You shrug. Depends on your glaze game. He mutters something about corrupt glazers and walks away. By now the heat is beginning to build, but the breeze carries the scent of herbs and hot sand. A small boy runs past you, barefoot and wild-eyed, holding a reed basket filled with garlic. For my uncle, he yells, dodging a goat. You wander past the scribal office and into the little market square where rejected taxpayers gather, muttering and calculating their offerings. Some trade quickly, swapping onions for cucumbers, hoping to find the perfect tax-worthy balance. A woman offers you 2 small cakes in exchange for one of your cousin's oil jars. You decline, but thank her. I'm off the hook this month. Lucky. I still owe 20 handfuls of lentils and a back massage for the overseer's cat. You both laugh. You're not even sure if she's joking. That's the thing. Taxes in Egypt weren't cold or impersonal. They were local, deeply social, and woven into the rhythm of village life. You paid with what you had, bartered for what you lacked, and hoped the scribes were in a forgiving mood. And if they weren't, well, there were always bribes, or cousins, or very charming monkeys. You head home as the sun dips behind the rooflines, casting everything in long amber shadows. The road feels soft under your feet. You hum a tune from your childhood, something about a cat who hoarded sesame seeds. It has nothing to do with taxes, but it helps. When you pass the palm grove near the canal, you spot an old man sitting cross-legged with a pile of smooth stones in front of him. He's murmuring to himself and tapping the stones into patterns. Counting debt, he says, not looking up. Your own. Everyone's. You leave him to it. By the time you reach your house, your cousin is already boiling water for tea. She lifts the kettle in a kind of triumph. Another month paid, she says. Barely, but paid. And that, in ancient Egypt, is what passes for a win. The next morning arrives with the smell of yeast and warm air. You wake to the quiet rustle of your cousin's shaping dough, her hands working as if guided by muscle memory, folding, flattening, pinching. The little clay oven out back crackles with life. A fresh loaf rises inside, its crust catching in the heat like sun on sandstone. You stretch and lean against the doorway, arms crossed, watching her with a sleepy sort of reverence. New recipe, you ask. Old one, she replies. Temple bread sweetened with carob. You whistle low. That's practically divine currency. Exactly. You see, in Egypt, bread isn't just breakfast. It's a building block of civilization. Payment, offering, sacrifice, snack. It does everything except sweep your floors. And even that's probably just a matter of time. Loaves came in a stunning variety of shapes too. Some were shaped like ducks, others like ears. Even flowers, not for decoration but for meaning. Each shape hinted at its purpose. Duck loaves for feasts, cone loaves for temple offerings, and the flower-shaped ones. Rumor says they were taxed higher because they cheered up the scribes. Historians still argue whether Egypt's symbolic bread system reflected deeper theological meanings, or if it was simply an extremely bureaucratic aesthetic choice. Probably both. Today, you're heading toward one of the most sacred places in the city, the granary. Not a dusty barn with rats and disrepair, but a fortress of food, impeccably organized, sealed, guarded and respected like a treasury. As you walk, the city pulses around you. Traders hawk wares, priests sweep temple steps, children dart between carts, trailing laughter like smoke, and all the while, grain moves, quietly, constantly, on the backs of donkeys inside leather sacks, balanced by skilled hands. You pass the scribe station again. Today the air smells like pickled fish. You don't ask questions. The granary itself looms ahead, mud brick walls plastered smooth and painted with faint traces of once vivid red ochre. You've heard rumors about this place. That inside, there are ledgers so old they predate your great-grandfather's teeth. That somewhere in its shadowy corners lies a scroll made entirely of bread ration receipts. The guards eye you but nod as you enter. You carry no grain today, only curiosity, and maybe a hope for a story or two. Inside, cool air settles like a hush. The long hall is lined with massive storage bins, shaped like inverted cones, mouths sealed with clay and rope. Each one holds a season's worth of survival. If a flood failed or locusts got clever, these bins could mean the difference between famine and feasting. A scribe sits on a low stool, tapping a reed stylus against his knee. His scroll is open beside him, half written. Name. You wave. Just visiting. He arches an eyebrow. You won't leave with anything. Wasn't planning to. Just soaking in the ambience. He mutters something about loaf, tourists and returns to his notes. Further down, a group of workers unloads grain from wide reed baskets into the bins. You pause to watch the rhythm of it. Scoop, pour, pat down. Scoop, pour, pat down. They hum as they work, a low repetitive chant that probably predates language. It almost makes you sleepy. Nearby, a young woman sits cross-legged, carefully counting loaves one by one. They are stamped with small seals on top, hieroglyphs baked directly into the crust. A quiet form of bureaucracy, edible and crumbly. She looks up at you. Wedges, she explains. For the temple guards, you nod. What happens if you eat one? You work a double shift. Makes sense. Bread is currency, yes, but it's also a contract. A worker at a tomb site might receive 5 loaves and 2 jars of beer per day. A high priest, double that plus honey cakes. And a pharaoh, well, he doesn't need to eat bread. He is bread, spiritually speaking. There's an old story of a village where a storm wiped out half the grain crop. With no coinage and little left to trade, the people formed what was probably Egypt's first loaf bank. They pooled their remaining bread, stored it in cool granary vaults, and issued little scraps of papyrus, receipts for loaves not yet eaten. When the flood receded and planting resumed, everyone brought in new loaves to replace their withdrawals, debt in bread form. If that isn't civilization, what is? You wander toward a niche where older scribes sit, deep in debate. One has a bead of sweat running down his forehead, likely because he's arguing that the bread tax should account for muffin shrinkage during baking. Another insists that temple offerings shouldn't include any bread containing onions. Too distracting for the gods. The truth is, bread has always been spiritual here. It was offered to gods, buried with the dead, and sometimes, if a priest was especially pious, used as a platform to bless water before ritual baths. Yes, blessed bread boards. Which sounds charming until you imagine the soggy cleanup. You remember, suddenly, that one of your neighbor's sons was once fined for presenting stale loaves during a religious festival. Not for poisoning anyone, just for lack of enthusiasm. You watch as an older woman carefully places a pyramid-shaped loaf into a marked bin, then pats it gently like tucking in a child. She doesn't say anything, doesn't need to. That loaf just paid her family's tax, or maybe settled a debt, or maybe it's a prayer. As you step back out into the sun, you breathe in the warmth, a comforting scent of yeast and heat. It clings to your clothes and settles into your hair, a soft reminder that your ancestors didn't pay their dues with faceless coins or stamped metals. They paid with what they pulled from the earth, kneaded with their hands, and baked with care. You smile to yourself. Bread, after all, rises. Just like hopes, just like taxes. Your feet crunch softly over gravel as you wander from the granary. The sun hangs lower now, casting long golden ribbons across the path, and your stomach grumbles, not because you're hungry, but because you've been surrounded by the scent of fresh loaves all day. You're convinced the smell has somehow seeped into your bones. You round a bend and spot a small market square. It's not the bustling kind where people yell about figs and haggle over fish guts. No, this one's quieter, more domestic. Clay pots line the ground like squat soldiers. A boy waves a palm fan over a cluster of cheese wheels, and an elderly woman displays baskets of dried dates like a proud museum curator. Your eyes fall on a little stall tucked between two date sellers. It's lined with neat rows of perfume bottles, slender glass tubes, squat alabaster jars, even a hollowed-out ostrich egg. The air wafts with hints of myrrh, lotus, and something sharp and citrusy that makes your nostrils do a double take. You approach slowly. Careful, says the vendor, a woman in a linen wrap with hair oiled into perfection. That one's made from blue lotus and crocodile oil. Took a month just to trap the smell. You nod, impressed. It's strong. She grins. It should be. That one pays a month's tax on a middle-sized goat farm. That stops you. Yes, it turns out, in ancient Egypt, perfume wasn't just luxury. It was liquid gold, and very much a form of payment. Particularly in the New Kingdom, aromatic oils and perfumed unguents became more than gifts for the gods or pharaoh's bedtime routine. They were taxable assets, trade goods, and even legal tender, especially in upper-class circles. A bottle of nard oil could get you out of a hefty labor tax. A rare Merah blend. That could settle your fish stall's annual dues. Historians still argue whether this perfume, as tax was standardized or more of a barter workaround. But plenty of records, etched in temple walls or written on fragile ostraca, hint at oils being weighed, valued, and exchanged right alongside grain, beer, and linen. You ask the vendor what her strongest seller is. Temple blend, she says, lifting a stopper from a ceramic jar with a flourish. Frankincense base, rose essence, hint of cinnamon, and just a trace of bull sweat. You recoil. Bull sweat? It's symbolic, she says, arching an eyebrow. Power, fertility, taxes. You're not entirely sure she's kidding. A young nobleman approaches and hands her a rolled scroll. She unrolls it carefully and nods, then selects a tall bottle with a gold-painted rim and places it in a cloth pouch. He leaves without saying a word. What was that, you ask? Tax receipt, she replies. He owed perfume to the temple of Amun. That blend's a favorite among their priests. Supposedly opens the nose to divine breath. You want to joke about divine sinuses but hold your tongue. Perfume, it seems, had deep roots in Egypt's economic and spiritual life. From embalming to seduction to sacred rites, fragrance was everywhere. There's even evidence that tomb workers were paid in small phials of scented oil during long stints in the desert, perhaps to mask the, well, let's say aromatic realities of life under the sun. You buy a tiny vial not for taxes, but for curiosity. The vendor wraps it carefully and tells you to keep it cool, or it'll turn into something resembling camel sweat left in a jar. Comforting. As you walk away, you pass a scribe's stand displaying a list of common, perfumed tax equivalents. A 1 jar of myrrh, 12 loaves, a 1 vial of lotus oil, 3 days temple service, or 1 priest's blend. One wheat grain levy, if well sealed you chuckle. It's basically the world's first luxury spreadsheet. Later that afternoon, you find yourself following a side street that hugs the edge of the canal. It smells like silt and roasted garlic, and something gently floral. Women rinse linens in the water, chatting softly. A boy floats by on a reed raft, humming to himself and splashing his toes. You almost envy his freedom. As you stroll, a temple looms into view. Its outer walls adorned with massive painted reliefs of gods and offerings. One panel catches your eye, a nobleman presenting what appears to be an elaborately shaped perfume jar to a towering figure of Thoth. The god is inspecting the jar, nose tilted just slightly. You grin. Even divine tax collectors have preferences. Inside the temple, priests glide barefoot along smooth flagstones. You overhear one instructing a novice on how to prepare an offering with 2 parts lotus to 1 of cinnamon. Too much cinnamon, and the statue sneezes. You wonder if gods can sneeze. It's easy to forget how practical the divine economy could be. Scented oils and incense weren't just spiritual gifts. They were part of the bookkeeping. Stored in sealed amphorae in temple treasuries, listed in ink on papyrus accounts, traded with merchants from far-off lands. Perfume moved across deserts and rivers. It sat on shelves and nestled in tombs, and it was taxed, like everything else. You take one last look at the temple, then head back toward the city center. The breeze carries the faintest trace of something sweet and unfamiliar. Maybe spikenard, maybe date blossom, maybe just the perfume seller's final laugh following you home. Either way, it lingers. You turn down a narrower street now, one where the cobbled stones are uneven and worn smooth by thousands of sandaled feet. The shadows stretch longer as you walk, and the city hums with that peculiar blend of routine and reverence. A woman leans from a window above to shake dust from a linen sheet, and the breeze sends a puff of it right into your face. You cough politely, because, well, you're a guest in this millennia-old place. Your destination, a lesser-known side of Egypt's tax story, its entanglement with temple economies. Not just divine perfume preferences and pyramid donations, but full-on temple-run accounting departments, complete with their own grain silos, scribes, and tax collectors with really bossy eyebrows. Temples weren't just spiritual centers, they were economic powerhouses. Entire regions funneled their production into temple storage: bread, cattle, linen, beer, honey, figs, incense, and yes, the occasional sandal tribute. Temples owned land, vast lush fields worked by tenant farmers, and those tenants paid taxes not to the king, but to the gods, technically. So, today you're visiting a temple that's less famous than Karnak or Luxor, but still significant, known for its detailed archives. The stone entrance bears the name of a local fertility deity, one whose eyebrows are somehow more expressive than yours. Inside it's cool and dark. Oil lamps flicker against thick columns, and the air smells of papyrus dust and fermented honey. You pass a group of novices learning to chant something that sounds like a weather report mixed with a hymn. A priest nods to you and gestures toward a side corridor. He knows why you're here. And there, tucked behind a curtain of blue linen, is the temple's tax room. Less majestic than you'd expect. There's a bored-looking clerk hunched over a reed scroll, and another dozing on a pile of sacks labeled with crude stick figures, probably symbolic shorthand for grain tribute from fisherman family from 43 Boyne. This room is a world of its own. A scribe, alert and surprisingly chatty, tells you that temples had separate tax calendars from the central government. "We go by the stars," he says, as though that explains everything. You squint at a wall chart, noting the days marked with little fish symbols. Apparently, those were the collection days for dried tilapia. Historians still argue whether temples overstepped their civic authority or acted as an early form of decentralized administration. Some scholars see them as proto-bureaucratic overlords, others as benevolent food banks with really high ceilings. Either way, their records are meticulous. One surviving account lists 2 leaven jars of honey paid by a single village, likely harvested over months and stored in clay jars sealed with linen and beeswax. Another entry shows an oddly specific penalty, 2 lengths of dyed linen, for failing to show up to sacred goat washing duty. You wonder how dirty that goat must have been to justify that fine. Is there much corruption? You ask. The clerk snorts softly. Depends who you ask. The gods know. The priests. Well, and that's where it gets complicated. Temple taxes weren't always fair. While the grand idea was that everyone gave a little something back to the divine, in practice, the lines between offering and obligation blurred. A perfume maker might offer a few vials of rose oil and suddenly find herself on a rotating tribute schedule for life. A farmer who donated grain during a flood year might be expected to keep it coming, even when the Nile failed to rise. You pause at a storage room. Massive amphorae line the walls, each marked with symbols: a bread loaf, a stalk of wheat, a sandal. One is simply stamped with the sign for sweet. You're told that one likely contains syrup, date or fig. Hard to tell until you open it. No one volunteers. Later, you sit with a young scribe who proudly shows you a tally sheet of temple credits. Turns out, some temples tracked contributions like a primitive loyalty program. Regular givers got their names etched into stela. Extra points if your donation came with a pun. One man named Sutak donated 12 baskets of onions during the festival of Bastat. He also included a note, "May the cat, goddess purr in my favor." You decide you like Sutak. Not everything is transactional though. The temple archives also list voluntary offerings, like handmade dolls, carved ivory combs, or the occasional tiny clay loaf stamped with the donor's family crest. Even the tax machine had a human side. As you leave the temple, a priest hands you a cone of incense and gestures toward a brazier. You light it respectfully, inhaling the soft waft of sandalwood and cinnamon. The priest nods, offering accepted. You exhale. You feel a little lighter, like you've paid something off, something old, something owed. The breeze shifts again. You turn toward the river, where the sky is burning orange, and the scent of baked fish drifts lazily on the air. Children chase each other along the bank, and in the distance, a boatman sings something off, key and full of joy. You wonder what taxes he's dodging today. You leave the temple's shadow and step once more into the light, blinking at the sudden warmth as you stretch your limbs. That incense cone still lingers in your nose, and maybe, just maybe, you feel a little more spiritually balanced after navigating the bureaucratic corridors of the divine. Though, let's be honest, you still don't entirely understand that goat washing fine. Today, you're heading into an even more peculiar part of Egypt's tax culture: taxation in perfume. And yes, you heard that right. Not perfume in the modern, overpriced department store sense, but in the deeply complex, labor-intensive concoctions brewed from flowers, oils, resins, and sometimes crocodile fat. No judgment. You follow the sweet, heady trail down the road to a perfumer's workshop. It's a small, walled compound, and from inside comes the faint sound of grinding, splashing, and some spirited humming. You duck beneath a curtain of woven reeds, and immediately get smacked in the face by the scent of something exotic and possibly flammable. A woman waves a wooden spoon in greeting, her arms streaked with streaks of oil and flecks of yellow pollen. "Come to pay in perfume?" she asks, eyes twinkling. You laugh nervously and step inside. Perfume in ancient Egypt wasn't just a luxury, it was currency, ritual, medicine, even diplomacy. Some blends took weeks to make, and were sealed with the scribe's seal as proof of their value. The taxes collected in these vials weren't for personal use either. They were offerings to the gods, embalming supplies for elite mummies, and diplomatic gifts to curry favor with foreign rulers. You could pay off a debt with 2 vials of black lotus, the perfumer says, pouring liquid from one amphora into another with the grace of a caffeinated heron. Historians still debate whether this practice was driven more by economic need or religious tradition. Some argue it was a practical workaround in a grain-based economy. Others claim it was about status, with perfume being a literal sign of spiritual and social cleanliness. You sniff at a jar labeled kaifi, a sacred blend with hints of myrrh, wine, honey, and something smoky that hits you like a memory you never lived. Used to help people sleep, she says, and bribe officials. In this fragrant world, the tax process was almost alchemical. Farmers or craftsmen would pay temple taxes not in coin or barley, but in jars of carefully mixed fragrance. The state had perfume specialists, appointed ones, who assessed the quality of each batch, often by sticking their noses right in the jar. You picture a room full of ancient Egyptian sommeliers, solemnly sniffing before scribbling hieroglyphic verdicts. Too resinous, not enough lotus, gives me flashbacks. Outside the workshop, the courtyard is filled with bundles of drying herbs and baskets of flower petals. Jasmine, lotus, blue water lily. You kneel by a vat of warm oil steeped with shredded cinnamon bark. The smell alone feels like payment. It takes 7 days to infuse properly. The perfumer warns, lifting a ladle, and even longer to train your nose not to fall in love with the wrong scent. A one tax scroll found near Thebes details a perfumer's annual obligation. 4 jars kaifi, 2 cones unguent, 1 sealed blend of sacred oil. No money changed hands. Just fragrance, labor, and that heady combination of economy and belief. You watch as she seals one of the jars with beeswax and presses a carved seal into it. A tiny ibis. "That's how the officials know it's mine," she says, "and that I paid my share." She hands you a tiny vial. "Here, for the road." It smells like sunlit stone and burnt honey. You walk out onto the path again, watching as a group of barefoot boys runs by chasing a ball made of linen scraps. One pauses, sniffing the air. Smells like rich people. He giggles, then dashes off. Along the road, traders pass carrying baskets balanced on their heads. One woman totes a tray of cakes, date and sesame, still warm. Another man walks with 2 heavy jars slung on a yoke, humming to himself. You realize those jars might be full of oil or taxes. That's the thing. Perfume wasn't always a side gig. For some, it was the main trade. You pass a stall where someone's bartering fish for a scented oil rub-down. Another nearby has 2 cones of lotus waxed at 1 loaf, signs scrawled on a pot shard. It's like an olfactory stock exchange. Values fluctuate, and everyone smells like they're trying too hard. Historians still argue whether perfume taxes primarily served the elite priesthood or filtered more broadly through society. One theory suggests rural temples relied on perfumed oils because they lacked grain surpluses. Others believe the entire practice began as a ritual and only later became monetized. You find yourself outside a small shrine, its entrance draped with marigolds. Inside, a few travelers light incense and murmur quiet prayers. You do the same, your little vial of sunlit stone perfume already warming in your hand. You dab a drop on your wrist, just enough, and in that scent, woven from spice, flour, resin, sweat, beeswax, and maybe a little desperation, you catch something timeless, the strange, poetic practicality of a people who could pay for their place in the world, not just with labor or food, but with beauty. The scent still clings to your wrist as you walk, warm and sweet like the ghost of a dream. You rub it gently with your thumb and wonder just how many tax officials have stood exactly where you are now, evaluating offerings not with ledgers and calculators, but with their noses. Today's path winds toward a quieter village on the edge of a papyrus marsh. Here your curiosity draws you toward a more grounded, crustier form of taxation: bread and beer, 2 pillars of Egyptian life, staple food, sacrament, currency, and, yes, standard tax payment. You pass a group of women kneeling in a courtyard, pounding barley in large stone mortars. Rhythmic, like a heartbeat. It's not just food they're making, it's a form of savings, an edible receipt, and sometimes a ticket out of trouble. Bread and beer in Egypt were so central to survival that they also became reliable ways to fulfill one's civic duty, or appease an irritated official. A boy waves you over, points to his mother's makeshift oven, just a pit of sand and brick with a clay dome over it. Inside, rows of loaves rise like pale bricks. He grins and whispers, "That one's for the scribe." You grin back, and suddenly taxes don't seem quite so intimidating. In most towns, scribes or temple officials maintain detailed tax rolls listing who owed what and when. For the average peasant or artisan, the annual due might be a certain number of loaves of bread, or jugs of beer, often tied to the Nile's flood cycle. No flood, smaller crop, less grain. Reduced taxes. Maybe. Or at least, that was the hope. Historians still argue whether this system was truly flexible or just presented as such to keep the masses compliant. Some say local officials gave grace periods. Others believe back taxes piled up faster than sourdough left in the sun. You duck into a shaded bakery hut. It's warm, smoky, and smells like everything good about carbs. A man pulls flatbreads from a heated slab, brushing off the ash. "This one's barley and emmer," he says proudly, handing you a piece. "Good for taxes. Keeps well." You bite in. Crunchy crust, dense interior, just the faintest sour note. Not bad for something potentially destined for a state warehouse. Egyptian beer, on the other hand, was less glamorous than you might think. Thick, cloudy, unfiltered. More like a barley smoothie than a modern pint. Still, it was the daily drink of nearly everyone. Hydration, calories, and spiritual fortification in one. In some tax records from the Middle Kingdom, entire households owed their dues in amphorae of beer. Workers on state projects, like pyramid construction or canal dredging, were often paid in beer and bread, which technically meant they were also paying their taxes forward through labor. Even the gods drink beer, the baker says with a wink, pouring you a taste from a fat clay jug. It smells faintly sour, earthy, alive, especially during festivals, or when taxes are late. At public festivals like the Feast of Opet, or the beautiful Festival of the Valley, temples collected enormous quantities of beer and bread, both as offerings and, not so coincidentally, as informal tax-gathering events. Imagine your town hosting a carnival where the price of entry is 5 loaves and a jug of your finest homebrew. Fun and fiscally strategic. "Sometimes we burned it as an offering," another woman says, pointing to a soot-stained stone altar. "Not the good loaves, though. The weird ones." You pass shelves stacked with differently shaped breads, some conical, others molded into animals, even one that looks like a hedgehog. "That one's ceremonial," she laughs. "Or possibly cursed. Historians can't agree. Indeed, archaeologists have found moldy loaves sealed in tombs, some baked with honey, dates, or herbs. They weren't always for eating. Some loaves were symbols of wealth, of devotion, of obligation met. And when taxes were paid in bread, it wasn't just sustenance. It was a statement. I give of my daily life to support the balance of my art. Back outside, you follow a donkey cart headed to the granary. The man leading it has 6 baskets of loaves tied neatly with twine and labelled with little wooden tags. State dues, he mutters. Don't want no trouble. Historians still argue about how centralised this system really was. Some say taxes in kind were tallied and stored in regional silos. Others believe much was redistributed locally, with scribes acting more like middle managers than imperial collectors. You imagine a bureaucratic chain of custody, where a loaf you baked on Monday is offered to a minor temple on Thursday, then traded to a baker in another village by next week, all tracked, of course, by a frowning scribe with ink, stained fingers, and a tolerance for stale bread. The sun is lowering, and you hear laughter in the distance. A group of children sit in a circle, sculpting miniature loaves from wet clay, practicing for adulthood. One girl says with a giggle, "Taxis are fun when they're tiny." You smile and sit with them for a while. The scent of baked grain and spiced beer wafts lazily through the air, and somewhere in the breeze, you catch that note of perfume again. Sweet, subtle, and utterly impractical for bread baking, but somehow perfect. In this world, where divine order and daily labour are needed together like dough, paying taxes in bread and beer makes an odd kind of sense. It's not just about obedience or obligation, it's about contribution, sustaining not just the government, but the gods, the neighbours, the festivals, and yes, even the accountants. You exhale, warm and full. Who knew being taxed could smell like honey and taste like barley? You wake to the earthy smell of reeds and a whispering breeze off the canal. The dawn light is pale gold, pooling lazily across mud brick walls and slatted papyrus roofs. You stretch, still a little full from yesterday's bread and beer, your body moving slowly, like it too has decided taxes can wait until after breakfast. But today's not about paying. Today's about collecting. You're shadowing a village scribe, the unflappable bureaucratic nerve centre of the Egyptian tax machine. He's already up, brush in hand, adjusting the folds of his linen kilt with a kind of wary dignity. He sees you and grunts, "Hope you brought sandals." Scribes were more than just human spreadsheets. They were record keepers, court clerks, teachers, surveyors, and, in this case, tax assessors. Their job was part data collection, part diplomacy, and part endurance sport. "Come," he says, hoisting a leather case filled with reeds and ink cakes. "We've got 3 households, 1 widow, and a particularly uncooperative goose farmer to deal with before the sun gets too smug." The two of you trudge down a dusty path lined with cracked pottery and drying fish. First stop, a potter's house. The air smells like clay and wood smoke, and the tax item in question is stacked neatly in the courtyard, ceramic bowls. 10 this season, the scribe mutters, squinting at his list. He owed 12 last flood. He doesn't bark or scold, he asks questions gently. Was there a fire? A family illness? A lost shipment? He writes down the answers in flowing hieratic script, nodding occasionally. Historians still debate whether this was compassion or just meticulous extortion. He tells you under his breath. The next home belongs to a beekeeper, and here payment comes in the form of honey. Thick, golden, stored in small conical jars sealed with mud. She offers the jars with pride, wiping sticky fingers on her sleeve. "Best batch since my mother's time," she says. The scribe notes the quantity, smells each one, even dips his finger for a taste. "Acceptable," he murmurs, sounding like a judge on a cooking show. "Tell the gods I said hello." Honey, like perfume, was a high-value tax item, especially prized by temples, but it was fragile, easily spoiled, easily stolen, and devilishly hard to weigh evenly. Some officials tried to tax it by volume, others by container, still others by vague declarations like a jarful. Chaos, in short, but sweet-smelling chaos. As you walk, the scribe grumbles about cracked ink pots and dodgy thatch roofs. "We're expected to keep records in the rain," he says, rolling his eyes, as if papyrus grows waterproof. You arrive at the widow's home, a humble, tidy place with a sleeping cat, draped across the entrance like a furry tax exemption. She greets the scribe by name, hands him a small pouch of dried dates and a woven mat. "All I could manage this season," she says softly. The scribe nods and scribbles without judgment. "There's always next flood," he says, "and at least your cat doesn't bite." In cases like hers, tax obligations could sometimes be reduced, particularly if temple officials or village councils vouched for her. But whether these remissions were codified or just granted on a whim is still hotly debated. Some historians argue there was a compassionate tier of tax relief. Others say scribes simply applied pressure based on who cried the loudest or baked the best bread. Then there's the goose farmer. You hear the honking before you even see the man. Dozens of geese parade through his yard like feathered soldiers, and he's red-faced, barefoot, and shouting at both birds and bureaucracy. "They're not ready!" he yells. "Too lean!" You can't take them yet. The scribe sighs and motions for you to stay back. What follows is a dance of negotiation, gesturing, and some impressive honking mimicry on the scribe's part. Eventually, 2 geese are cornered, examined, and accepted. One bites the scribe. He doesn't flinch. Goose bites don't make the ink run, he mutters. As you return to the scribal bench near the village granary, the scribe lays out his tools. He has tax entries to log, reports to copy, and one very smug goose to sketch for his personal collection. You have to find humor where you can, he shrugs. Otherwise you'll go mad and start taxing clouds. The sun now beams confidently overhead, and the air hums with quiet productivity. Grains being pounded, reeds being cut, arguments being rehearsed in case tax agents return. You sit beside him as he fills the papyrus with graceful symbols. Cows, birds, measures, loaves, each one a tiny ledger line in Egypt's vast economic symphony. What strikes you is the intimacy of it all. These weren't anonymous taxes deducted from your pay stub. These were face-to-face exchanges, evaluated, sometimes argued, sometimes shared with a sip of beer and a sigh. The tax system relied not just on obedience, but on a delicate dance of relationships, expectations, and the occasional overlooked goose. You ask the scribe what happens if someone simply doesn't pay. He shrugs. Depends. If they're powerful, nothing. If they're poor, more taxes. He pauses, then adds, sometimes, though, they vanish from the rolls, re-signed to the dead, or the desert. You blink. Paperwork is flexible, he says, dipping his pen, especially if you know how to fold it. As he works, you notice a pile of rejected offerings, a jar of spoiled beer, a cracked pot, a bundle of linen that smells like old goats. Not every payment makes the cut, and yet the system persists, groaning, generous, flawed, but remarkably functional for something built on reeds, ink, and unfiltered barley juice. The scribe finally leans back, stretches his fingers, and says, and tomorrow, we go to the market town. Merchants are much louder. You groan in sympathy. He smiles. That's taxation, friend. Some days it's honey, some days it's honking. You wake in the pale lavender hush before sunrise, heart heavy with the knowledge that today's assignment is not with quiet farmers or mat-weaving widows, but with merchants, those swaggering alchemists of coin and chaos. The scribe is already sharpening his reed pen against a flint, looking particularly grumpy. Merchants lie for sport, he mutters without looking up. They're like cats, too clever, and they hiss if you touch their silk. You follow him toward the market town, where the clamour begins long before the stalls open. The air is thick with the smell of fish and roasting onions, interlaced with wafts of exotic resin and, oddly, someone burning something that might once have been bread. A donkey brays in the distance. Two dogs argue over a melon rind. Welcome to commerce. Egyptian marketplaces were not just for buying goods. They were the pulsating hearts of regional tax systems. Unlike village farms, where tax was paid in kind, geese, honey, grain, the cities demanded a more flexible approach. Here taxes were levied on shopfronts, stalls, luxury imports, and sometimes the transaction itself. One fish, one tax. Two fish, possibly a bribe. You reach the scribal desk, a makeshift table tucked beside a wall fresco of Thoth, the ibis, headed god of wisdom and record-keeping. He looks appropriately exasperated. First merchant, the scribe calls, and into view sweeps a man dripping in gold bangles, his hair slicked back with what might be imported sesame oil. Aye, the scribe mutters. Perfume dealer. This man deals in scented oils, frankincense, and those little ceramic vials shaped like lotus buds. Perfume, as it turns out, was big business. Women wore it on their wigs. Priests burned it daily. Lovers exchanged it like secret poems. It was also, as the scribe points out, maddeningly hard to tax. The merchant insists his shipment was damaged and wrote, bandits, he says, gesturing dramatically. Or maybe crocodiles. Either way, I cannot pay in full. The scribe raises one unimpressed eyebrow. Historians still argue whether perfume merchants were genuinely unlucky, or just exceptionally creative with their excuses. In the end, the man offers a small chest of myrrh and 3 vials of something that smells suspiciously like garlic and regret. The scribe accepts the myrrh, but scribbles a note pending investigation. Smells weird. Next comes a linen seller, her stall stacked high with crisp bolts of pale fabric. She explains the thread count, the loom quality, the priestly demand for burial-grade linen. This is Egypt's textile pride, a currency in itself, but she too has a twist. I paid my temple levy already, she says sweetly. Do I look like someone who'd lie to Thoth? The scribe smiles without smiling. Let's just say Thoth and I cross-reference. You glance at the ledger. It's starting to look like an elaborate game of barter, bluff, and bureaucratic fencing. The scribe isn't just tracking numbers. He's weighing character, social standing, and the persuasive power of a good backstory. A pottery dealer arrives with crates of wine jugs. Except, as he points out, they're empty wine jugs. I sold the wine, he shrugs, but you're welcome to smell the insides. Taxation by aroma, the scribe mutters, promising new method. In truth, much of Egypt's taxation was semi-formal, especially in urban centres. Without coinage until much later, value had to be estimated in grain equivalents or service proxies. You might owe 3 measures of barley, even if you only sold coal eyeliner. It was up to scribes and local officials to translate goods into obligations. A messy process, and one prone to loud voices and lost records. A one-spice vendor insists he's already paid, in cinnamon. "Ask the harbour scribe!" he cries. He took it straight from the shipment. The scribe sighs. That man couldn't smell cinnamon from camel dung. Still, he notes it. Cinnamon was rare and highly taxable, likely imported from India through Nubian intermediaries. That makes it especially tempting to fudge. Historians still debate whether certain spices were taxed more because they were rare or just because officials liked hoarding them. You sit back as the morning wears on, watching the scribe juggle personalities like clay jars, sometimes stern, sometimes indulgent, but always with a weathered elegance. He tells you that in years of drought, the market taxes sometimes softened, and in years of plenty, they grew teeth. Flexibility, he says, is the backbone of oppression, and also its soft underbelly. At midday, a perfumer returns. New batch, she says, dropping off 3 vials of oil that smell like crushed hibiscus, mango, and a whisper of sandalwood. The scribe raises an eyebrow. See, not garlic this time. You ask whether perfume counted as luxury or necessity. Depends, the scribe replies. Luxury for the poor, a necessity for priests, a bribe for everyone else. You ask how taxes ever got collected in such chaos. He points at his scroll. Because I write it down. The day ends with the arrival of a caravan master, his face dusted with sand, his robe stiff with sweat and spices. He hands over a small satchel of turquoise beads, freshly traded from the Sinai mines. These are valuable, for the temple, he says. And one for you. The scribe sniffs. You think I'm corrupt? The man shrugs. You think I'm honest? The scribe chuckles and accepts nothing, at least not visibly. He jots down the transaction, eyes flicking from bead to ledger to sky. Later, as you pack up, he turns to you and says, "Some days, taxation is like herding cats. Others, it's like herding cats that speak 6 languages and wear gold jewelry." You ask if he ever dreams about tax scrolls. He looks genuinely horrified. "No, but I have dreamed of drowning in perfume," which frankly would be a very Egyptian way to go. The sun dips low over the market town, casting long golden shadows across the stalls. You walk back along the canal, the scent of cinnamon and sweat clinging to your tunic. It's easy to forget that what you saw today, jokes, lies, scents, scribbles, is the foundation of a 1,000-year-old bureaucracy. Not efficient, not fair, but astonishingly human. By now you've grown used to the ebb and flow of Egypt's daily taxation dance. Quiet farms, sticky market stalls, scribes who grumble in metered sighs. But today, you're stepping behind the high limestone walls of a structure most people only whisper about the granary. You thought grain was just something that went into porridge. Oh no. In ancient Egypt, grain is power. Grain is the ledger, the bribe, the punishment, and the prize. And the granary, it's the Fort Knox of the Nile. The building rises like a squat sentinel along the canal, its outer walls sun-bleached and guarded by 2 men who have clearly not had a nap in years. Their sticks aren't ceremonial. They nod at your scribe companion, who hands them a wax tablet marked with an official seal. Inside, the smell is intense. A mix of dust, chaff, sweat, and that odd fermentation note you get when wheat pretends to be beer but hasn't quite committed. You step onto a raised platform and gaze out across the storage pits, some dug into the ground, others sealed in towering clay silos. Every granary is its own little world, organized in columns and rows like a library of carbs. Here's how it worked. Farmers paid taxes primarily in grain. Wheat, barley, emmer, all carefully measured in hekat, about 4.8 litres per unit, then weighed, recorded, and dumped into the public stores. This grain went on to feed state workers, priests, soldiers, temple animals, and scribes who like to snack while pretending to be above it all. But there's a twist. Not all grain is created equal. Some came from better soil, or was better milled. Some was cleaner, free of weevils and rat gifts. And some, well, was practically dirt with a hint of cereal. Historians still argue whether officials truly checked the grain's quality or just played favorites. Your scribe says, poking a suspicious sack. Personally, I wouldn't feed this to a half-drunk goat. He's not wrong. One sack smells vaguely like someone stored sandals in it. A clerk approaches with a tally sheet, a thin sliver of wood painted in neat lines of black and red ink. Each entry marks the date, the name of the taxpayer, the amount of grain delivered, and where it's stored. If you thought your tax form was confusing, imagine it written in hieratic, measured in jugs, and subject to sudden mildew. And yet, this was a system, incredibly robust, shockingly thorough. These records allowed the state to plan rations, organize construction projects, and during famines survive. When the Nile failed, the grain store saved lives, or, at least, made people slightly less miserable. Still, corruption wasn't uncommon. Grain could be siphoned off, mislabeled, or lost in transport. One low-ranking worker tells you in a whisper, "Some scribes eat better than nobles. Ever met a skinny one? You notice your scribe adjusting his belt uncomfortably. Suddenly, there's a commotion near one of the side silos. A cart has overturned, spilling grain into the dust. Workers scramble with woven baskets, trying to salvage what they can. The overseer, a man with a voice like a conch shell, bellows something about dockyard quotas and grains of sand disguised as barley. You lean over to help, and a boy hands you a palm leaf scoop. The grain is warm from the sun, spilling between your fingers like ancient gold. You wonder how many back-breaking hours it took to harvest this, how many hands passed it along, and how quickly a few rats could undo all that effort. Grain tax wasn't just physical, it was emotional. For a farmer, giving up part of their harvest could mean hunger. But if they didn't, punishment followed. Whippings, confiscation, forced labor. The system had its gentle incentives: you keep some, but also its sharp stick. Some say the granary was the soul of Pharaoh's wealth. Your scribe mutters. Others say it was the devil's bread basket. Honestly, it depends who's guarding the door that day. You spend hours inspecting ledgers, watching workers hoist sacks onto low platforms, and hearing disputes over incorrect tallies. One man swears he delivered 6 hectares, not 4. "The ox cart tilted!" he protests. The clerk responds. Then your tax tilted with it. Your scribe makes a quiet note and lets it go. Justice, like grain, can spill easily. Before leaving, you're shown a locked inner chamber where ceremonial grain is kept. This is the good stuff, sifted, clean, stored in sealed jars for temple use. You're told that priests sometimes tested the purity by smell alone. Others relied on dreams, or on whether the rats ignored it. Historians still debate whether these rituals were religious, or just really fancy quality control. On the way out, you catch sight of a small shrine built right into the granary wall. A crude carving of Renenutet, the cobra goddess of nourishment and grain. Offerings of old bread and dried flowers surround it. A worker bows as he passes, murmuring something under his breath. You ask if she's supposed to guard the harvest. "She guards us from the scribes," the worker replies, "and from mold." You exit into the golden afternoon light, shoes full of grain dust and head full of numbers. It's hard to overstate the role these places played. Taxes weren't just documents and threats. They were woven into the rhythms of life, stored behind heavy walls, measured by hands both fair and not so fair. As you walk along the canal, you flick a single grain from your tunic. Just one. But that one grain, counted, taxed, stored, and possibly bartered, is a speck of civilization. A whisper from a time when wealth didn't jingle in pockets, but crunched underfoot. The next morning, you're back on your feet, or more accurately, your sandals, following a winding reed-lined path toward a much smaller building. One often overlooked in grand histories of pyramids and power, the perfumery. Yes, a perfumery. In ancient Egypt, taxes weren't all about sacks of barley and pyramids worth of red tape. Sometimes, they smelled suspiciously like lilies and myrrh. Your scribe is already fanning himself with a folded palm leaf as you enter. "This," he says dramatically, "is where luxury meets bureaucracy." The scent hits you before your eyes adjust to the filtered sunlight. Sweet, earthy, spicy, and floral all at once. It's like walking into a dream or a well-funded yoga studio. Clay vessels line the walls, each sealed with beeswax and marked with elaborate symbols denoting the blend inside. Some jars are humble and utilitarian, others etched with gold, leaf hieroglyphs, testament to their value. And value they had. Perfume in Egypt wasn't a frilly afterthought, it was a currency. And for tax collectors in Thebes or Memphis, it was just as good as grain, sometimes better. A hunched artisan beckons you to a workbench where crushed petals, resins, and oils simmer together in a copper vessel heated by coals. You watch, slightly hypnotized, as she stirs the mixture with a curved bronze rod. "Taxes in perfume," she says with a cackle. "Depends how badly the officials stink." In truth, scented oils were incredibly important, not just for smelling nice, but for medicine, rituals, embalming, and temple offerings. The finest blends, kefi lotus oil, frankincense infusions, were taxed heavily, often paid by temple suppliers or elite perfume makers who sourced rare ingredients from places like Punt or Nubia. Historians still argue whether perfumes were taxed based on quantity, rarity of ingredients, or simply how much a scribe liked the smell your companion offers, poking a jar labeled with a symbol that looks suspiciously like a loaf of bread with a nose above it. At the back of the perfumery, an apprentice pours liquid from one jar into another, careful not to spill a single drop. You learn that perfumes were stored in alabaster bottles, often sealed with linen and labeled by scent and potency. Some were so prized that they were used as dowry goods, or tax collateral. You owe 3 amphorae of myrrh and 1 of blue lotus, a scribe might say, chewing his reed stylus. And don't try swapping in sesame oil again, he'd add with a glare. While perfume was often associated with temples and upper-class rituals, everyday folks used it too, especially for religious festivals. If you couldn't afford a grand statue or a gold ring, a few drops of fragrant oil on a shrine might earn the gods' favor, and, occasionally, a tax break. You crouch beside an elderly woman grinding cinnamon bark with a stone mortar. Her hands are dark with years of work, but steady. "People think taxes are only for bread and barley," she mutters. "But what's barley without beauty? Even the gods want to smell good." The perfumery, you realize, is its own kind of bank. Instead of coin purses jingling with copper d'eben, you have shelves of aroma, bound value. It's a treasury where worth is measured not in weight, but in scent. You ask whether all perfumes were accepted for taxes. Your scribe grimaces. "Only if registered and approved. And don't even think about bringing homemade blends. One whiff of donkey sweat and you'll be slapped with a purity fine." That's not a joke, by the way. Purity inspections were real, just like with grain. Tax officials were supposed to ensure the quality of perfumes, though this usually meant a quick sniff, a muttered curse, and an official seal if nobody fainted. Interestingly, temples often acted as middlemen in this fragrant economy. Many collected perfume taxes directly, storing them in sacred vaults to be used during elaborate ceremonies, especially those involving the dead. Embalming, after all, was a perfumer's dream job. Costly, smelly, essential. And if you think modern bureaucracy is annoying, imagine haggling over the ratio of cardamom to rosewater in your annual tax. Some tax collectors were reportedly bribed with samples of superior oil just to ensure a favorable evaluation. This wasn't mere corruption, it was an aromatic negotiation. Historians still debate whether this practice was tolerated or quietly encouraged. Your scribe whispers as the artisan offers him a dab of ambergris, infused oil on his wrist. He nods approvingly and jots something in his tablet. As the afternoon heat settles over the workshop, you wander out into the tiny herb garden just beyond its walls. Papyrus stalks sway beside fields of marjoram, sweet rush, and henna. Bees float lazily from blossom to blossom. A woman in a linen shift waters the roots with a jar, singing softly to the plants. The scent of history lingers here, not carved in stone or etched in monuments, but infused in the petals, resins, and oils of Egypt's fragrant ledger. Taxes, you're beginning to understand, weren't merely demands, they were exchanges of essence. A nation's wealth wasn't just what it harvested, but how it smelled. And somewhere, in a bureaucrat's ledger scratched onto a faded ostrakhan, there's a line that reads, "Received 3 flasks lotus oil, strong grade. Accepted." Later that same day, you trail behind your scribe again, his sandals flapping in the dust, as you're ushered into a much less aromatic, but equally strange setting, the bread granary. Forget the perfumed luxuries for a moment. This is where taxation meets carbs. The air smells like warm wheat and yesterday's sweat. Rows of sun-dried mud silos rise like stumpy towers, each one stuffed with grain sacks or, more curiously, tall baskets filled with loaves. You blink. Yes, literal loaves of bread, organized by size and shaped like someone's idea of a very unappetizing art gallery. You're looking at a vault of bread taxes. Your scribe announces, arms outstretched like a magician unveiling his fine ale. "This is breakfast, bureaucracy style." A bread was the true backbone of Egyptian life, both spiritually and practically. You didn't just eat it, you worked for it, you paid with it. You even died with a few loaves tucked into your tomb, just in case the afterlife had poor catering. And here, in this warm, crumb-filled room, bread is more than food, it's accounting. An overseer with flour in his eyebrows waves you over to a tall table stacked with differently marked loaves. Each one bears a tiny thumbprint or a baked-in symbol. This isn't decorative, it's bookkeeping. You're seeing receipt loaves. Historians still argue whether these stamps denoted the baker, or the taxpayer, or the temple that owned the batch. Your scribe notes, poking a particularly dry-looking specimen with his stylus. You reach for a round, flat loaf stamped with a dot pattern. It's heavier than you expect. Some loaves, you're told, were fortified with crushed beans or ground acacia pods. Cheaper filler materials for folks who owed more than they could actually bake. If you're picturing daily tax officials wandering around nibbling crusts to check quality, you're not far off. There were entire professions built around the weighing, inspecting, and accepting of bread as tax. And if your loaves were undercooked, you risked a surcharge, overjected, odd shape, suspicious, mold, absolutely not. Ooh, you wouldn't believe how many people try to hide rocks in their loaves to fake weight. The overseer grumbles, lifting one loaf like a bowling ball and thumping it on the table. It does not sound soft. There's something deeply funny and kind of sad about the idea of a stressed-out farmer needing desperately at midnight to make enough taxable bread, and not just any bread. Bread that passes inspection, earns the right stamp, and doesn't mysteriously vanish into a tax collector's lunch sack. You notice that some bread has been wrapped in linen, others in palm leaves. These weren't just edible, they were ceremonial. Temples required specific types of bread as offerings, often dozens per day, and those quotas were fulfilled by, you guessed it, bread taxes. In some towns, your scribe adds, temples set the quotas so high, they had to invent entire new bread shapes just to keep things interesting. One such variety looks disturbingly like a duck. Another has holes poked through it like a tinny stone wheel. Holy bread, the overseer mutters with a wink. You groan. But it's not all jokes and crumbs. Bread also represented labor. Instead of currency, workers, especially those building temples and tombs, were often paid in daily rations of bread and beer. It was a barter system in yeast and grain, a tax and payment loop that kept the whole Nile economy rolling. And while it might sound quaint now, it was a fiercely organized system. Overseers tracked how much grain was baked into which kinds of loaves, and which households owed what amount, often down to a fraction of a sack, or a slice. The Egyptians didn't need gold coins, not when they had a fully edible spreadsheet. One apprentice holds up a small clay token to show you, etched with a sheaf of grain and a single loaf. It's a bread chit, your scribe says, a placeholder for taxes owed. You hand it in, and the state expects actual bread later. Think of it like ancient IOUs. Except you can't eat the IOU, unless you're very desperate or very confused. Historians still debate whether these tokens were widespread or only used in major temple towns. Your scribe muses. You've found them mostly near major granaries, but there are references in papyri that suggest broader use. As the sun begins to set behind the granary walls, casting long shadows over the baskets, you find yourself oddly comforted by the scent of warm grain and earth. Something ancient, deeply human, resides in this space. These loaves aren't just food. They're memory. They tell you who baked them, why, when, and for whom. They carry the story of debt and devotion, labor and loss. You reach for a final loaf, slightly cracked on top, dense and fragrant. The overseer nods. That one came in this morning, from a widow, paid her whole year's dues in one basket. It's humbling. Not every economy needs coins. Sometimes, the entire structure of a civilization can rest on the crusty shoulders of a humble loaf of barley bread. Just don't forget to stamp it. You leave the granary behind, the scent of yeast and dust still clinging to your robes, and follow your guide toward a quieter part of town. A narrow street that smells faintly of jasmine and goat. The pace slows. This is where the farmers and tradespeople live, far from the perfume merchants and administrative scribes. Here tax doesn't always come in neat loaves or flasks. Sometimes it clucks. You pause beside a modest courtyard where an elderly woman in red ribbon shawl gently coaxes a row of hens into a shaded coop. Her neighbor, balancing a large basket on her head, carries onions so pungent your eyes water just looking at them. This is the in-kind tax zone, a place where your obligations are paid not in coins, but in cabbages, clay pots, dried fish, and the occasional extremely disgruntled goose. Not everyone had access to perfume. Your scribe murmurs as he gestures toward the modest homes, but taxes found them anyway. He explains how the state collected non-monetary tributes from rural populations, especially those too poor to bake hundreds of loaves or distill fancy oils. Instead, villagers paid with whatever they produced, sometimes on a schedule, sometimes in response to sudden temple demands or royal decrees. One man steps out of a doorway with a woven sack of garlic bulbs and hands them to a tax collector seated cross-legged on a mat, lazily recording names on a papyrus sheet. It's both casual and formal. Everyone knows the rules, but nobody's rushing. You hear a joke about a man who once tried to pay with a basket of scorpions. Not accepted. Your guide leans closer. Historians still argue whether these rural taxes were standardized or negotiated informally. In some regions, records suggest flat-rate quotas. In others, they appear more, shall we say, flexible. You imagine that flexibility probably had something to do with how well you treated your local official. A smile here, a warm basket of dates there, perhaps a fresh fish on the side. Bribery, hospitality, definitely. You pass a family shaping little mud figurines, each representing a tiny sheep, fish, or fruit, offerings meant not just for religion, but sometimes for tax-related rituals. In Egypt, religion and bureaucracy didn't just overlap, they were braided like strands of date palm rope. Offering something to the gods often meant also giving it to the temple economy. There's a temple gate up ahead, and you drift toward it with the crowd, where peasants line up bearing gifts for the gods that just so happen to also count as taxes. You see a teen with a jug of beer, sweeting nervously. An older man with a fan of lotus roots. A mother with a string of dried figs tied around her waist like a sash. And then, of course, a goat. The goat stares at you with the blank, resigned expression of an animal that knows it has debts to pay. There was no separation between sacred and civic. Your scribe mutters. Taxes to the temple were taxes to the state, and vice versa. One god's donation is another administrator's breakfast. You laugh quietly, but it's true. In ancient Egypt, taxation was as much about cosmic order as it was about economics. The pharaoh, after all, wasn't just a king, he was divine. To pay your taxes was to help sustain Mat, the sacred balance. It wasn't just civic duty, it was moral responsibility, a cosmic receipt. Some temples even displayed detailed tax records on their walls. Picture it, stone-carved spreadsheets of who brought which chicken, when, and in what condition. Forget gold leaf and murals of gods. These were bureaucratic masterpieces, etched for eternity. And in these rural zones, things could get creative. Lacking goods, Some families offered labor instead of repairing irrigation channels, clearing weeds from temple fields, or hauling baskets during harvest season. It's like paying off your taxes by cleaning your local library for a month, except hotter, dustier, and with more crocodiles. You approach a woman carefully wrapping small bundles of herbs in papyrus strips. Anise, fenugreek, maybe dried mint, spice tax. Your guide says, shrugging. More valuable than bread in some circles. And there's still another oddity. A potter nearby quietly places a jug at the temple steps, and filled not with wine or grain, but with clean Nile water. Tax paid in water, apparently yes. In times of ritual or drought, even the most basic elements, shade, firewood, water, had worth. Everything could be taxed if it was useful enough. Historians still debate the full extent of these micro-taxes. Your scribe says, how far did the state reach into daily life? Did every cabbage count? Or just the ones near temples? No one knows for sure. The papyri are patchy, the murals selective, the oral histories long faded. But here, in this dusty alley of barter and basil, it's easy to imagine a world where taxation wasn't something you dreaded every April. It was just part of being alive, part of belonging. It wasn't about punishment. It was about participation. And as you watch the goat finally shuffle through the temple gate, unimpressed but obedient, you wonder, maybe that's the oldest deal of all. You give a little, and everyone, including the goat, plays their part in keeping the whole improbable machine running. You linger a while longer near the temple gate, watching as offerings pass from hand to hand, fruits, herbs, bits of linen, all marked for the divine yet fated to end up in a clerk's ledger. But now, your scribe is beckoning again. You follow, your sandals crunch over gravel and dry palm husks as you leave the bustle behind. The air smells of sun-warmed clay. Somewhere nearby, a donkey brays, utterly unconcerned with matters of taxation or cosmic order. You envy him. Your guide gestures toward a low mud brick building near the river's edge, an artisan's compound, where laborers contribute not just goods but craft. Welcome, he says, to the part of tax nobody likes to talk about: mandatory service. It's a little like jury duty, but sweatier. In Egypt's tax system, corvée labor, unpaid, state-mandated work, was common. If you didn't have enough bread or perfume to meet your quota, the state might kindly invite you to spend a few weeks hauling bricks, dredging canals, or painting tomb walls. Not exactly a vacation. Your eyes are drawn to a group of young men mixing mortar with their feet, singing in rhythm to pass the time. Behind them, older craftsmen chip away at limestone, carving delicate shapes that will decorate a nobleman's tomb, whether they want to or not. Tax through talent, your guide quips. Offer your labor, and hope the inspector's in a good mood. The irony. Some of these forced artisans were incredibly skilled. 3 days ago, Egypt's most beautiful monuments weren't just the work of paid professionals. They were also shaped by conscripted villagers, hauled in from the countryside during flood season when farming wasn't possible. Historians still argue whether this system was exploitative or pragmatic. Your guide adds, was it fair redistribution of idle labor, or just ancient burnout culture? You look at a man smoothing the edge of a column base with bare hands, sweat gleaming on his back, and decide it was probably a bit of both. Here's the twisting: artisans also paid taxes on the materials they used. If you were a potter, your clay was taxed. If you worked with incense, you owed part of the batch to the temple. Even artists had to court up pigment. Imagine getting taxed on your paintbrushes. It's enough to make any modern freelancer groan in empathy. But the real kicker, masterpieces didn't exempt you. Even if your mural adorned the royal palace, if your roof leaked, you'd still be expected to pay up. Perhaps in leftover ochre, a jar of alp, or a few hours spent smoothing palace floors. Fame didn't mean freedom. You wander deeper into the compound. 2 men are embroidering ceremonial sashes with gold thread. Delicate, precise work done with calloused fingers. You watch mesmerized as they whisper about the tax inspector's cousin, who tried to pay his dues with a tunic so poorly sent, it fell apart in the sun. The gods, they joke, were not impressed. Quality mattered. Your scribe notes. A bad offering could be rejected, and that meant penalties. That's the thing about ancient Egyptian taxes. They weren't always about quantity. A farmer's single jar of excellent honey might be accepted more readily than a merchant's armful of bruised figs. And if your work was beautiful enough, it might even win you favor. Extra rations, smoother audits, or a more comfortable work assignment next season. So, you begin to see the odd reality: taxes in Egypt weren't just obligations. They were also opportunities. To show off, to gain standing, even to win divine favor. You paid in goods, but you also paid in skill, and that made everything just a little more complicated. Nearby, a young woman is carefully binding reed baskets for temple storage. Her hands move with practiced grace, weaving patterns as familiar to her as your smartphone keyboard is to you. She doesn't look resentful. If anything, she hums while she works. You sit for a moment, letting the sun warm your shoulders as the day drifts by. A breeze picks up, stirring the scent of wood smoke and myrrh, and in that sleepy moment you wonder what would you have offered. A jar of honey, a hand-carved cat statue, A slightly lopsided loaf of barley bread, hopefully something better than a broken tunic. Your guide sighs beside you, brushing dust from his scrolls. Everything here was a negotiation, he says. Labor, goods, skill, even time itself. You nod, watching as a teenage boy struggles to align decorative tiles under the eyes of a stern older woman. His mother, probably. She smacks his shoulder with a reed if he slouches. Work now, worship later, she mutters, and the boy straightens. And it hits you again, this isn't just taxation. It's daily life, built into the rhythm of sun and flood and sweat and offering. Here, to work is to give, and to give is to be counted. A single life, bound up in barley and brick, pigment and prayers. By now, the afternoon shadows have begun to stretch long across the courtyard, and your legs are dusted in a fine film of Nile silt and wind-blown sand. But the day isn't done. Not in Egypt. Not in a world where even the breeze might be taxed, if the officials could find a way to bottle it. Your guide waves you toward a cluster of papyrus boats bobbing lazily on the riverbank. Time to meet the tax collectors on water patrol, he says, grinning like someone who's about to introduce you to the cousin everyone pretends not to know. You sigh and follow. The Nile gleams in the waning light, all gold and ochre and glassy ripples. You step carefully into a reed-lined skiff, low to the water and fragrant with old resin. It wobbles beneath your weight. Definitely not OSHA approved. These floating tax offices were real. Mobile inspectors who drifted downriver with scrolls, ink and attitudes, visiting villages, recording inventories, and collecting does like a very damp version of the IRS. As the boat glides silently across the current, you begin to understand the logic. Egypt's great highway wasn't a dusty road. It was this river. If you controlled the Nile, you controlled movement, trade, communication, and, crucially, payment. You pass another boat laden with baskets of grain. The oarsman nods solemnly, his vessel a kind of floating invoice. That grain isn't just food. It's part of someone's tax burden. A tithe in transit. Historians still argue whether these river audits were fair or intimidating. Your guide mutters. Most agree it depended entirely on the mood of the scribe and the size of your bribe. Ah yes, bribes. The great unspoken lubricant of every tax system since time began. You spot a tiny clay jar passed quietly from one palm to another. Probably beer. Possibly perfume. Definitely hush money. There's even a word the scribes like to use, backshish. 3 days ago. A little something to make the paperwork lighter. Smooth the ink. Soften the blow of a missed quota. You can't help imagining the scene. A fisherman caught of his payment in dried catfish offers, instead a rare river lotus, supposedly blessed by a crocodile priest. The scribe accepts it with and scribbles, paid in full, in a tidy hand. Everyone floats on, morally compromised but fiscally satisfied. And speaking of compromise, the Nile tax inspectors had a strange habit. They taxed fish by species. Tilapia cost more than perch. Crocodiles, presumably, were encouraged to self-report. What's more, the Nile served as both route and tax evasion route. Some cheeky villagers tried hiding extra grain in hollowed logs, or even under floorboards of boats, hoping the inspectors wouldn't notice. Spoiler, they noticed. Ancient papyri are full of angry notes like, farmer attempted concealment, deducted accordingly. Imagine getting audited by boat. Still, your guide says, not all river taxes were terrible. Some were seasonal. Others were suspended during floods or droughts. Flexibility existed. It just usually favored the temples. Temples again. You look out at a shrine partially submerged in reeds, where priests in leopard skins light oil lamps at twilight. Yes, the temple economy moved with the water too. Back on shore, you spot an old fisherman hauling up his nets, humming under his breath. He's got 3 fish and a broken sandal to show for it. His tax. 1 fish and a promise to return next week. Sometimes, that was enough. Here's a wild one. During the New Kingdom, certain elite fishermen were allowed to pay taxes in exotic fish oils, used for everything from cooking to mummification balm. The oil of the Nile carp, for example, was apparently prized for anointing sacred idols, which means somewhere, someone had to write on a scroll, received 3 ounces of fish juice. Value, moderate. And don't forget the boat tax itself. Own a vessel longer than a few cubits, pay a levy, even if it's rotting, even if it leaks, especially if it leaks. You lean against the boat's edge as it drifts past a riverside tax booth, basically a glorified lean-to with a bored scribe fanning himself with a palm frond. A goose honks loudly nearby, offended by something invisible, possibly the tax rate. Suddenly your guide leans in, whispering, "Want to know a secret? There's one group that almost never got taxed." You raise an eyebrow. River dolphins. You blink. Is that a joke? No, really, he says. Some villagers believed they were messengers of the gods. To tax them, or worse, to eat them, was considered blasphemy. You both pause, gazing out at the darkening water, half hoping for a divine fin to break the surface. The Nile wind cools as the sun melts into the horizon. Lanterns flicker to life along the banks. Somewhere, a scribe is tolling jars of river mud as payment from a potter with no silver. And you stretch out in the boat, lulled by the gentle current, and the smell of damp reeds and the faint, eternal hum of bureaucracy. a world where fish can be taxes, where perfume pays rent, where river dolphins have diplomatic immunity. Only in ancient Egypt. The boat docks quietly at a crumbling stone quay, where the scent of night jasmine clings to the humid air and frogs chirp from unseen banks. Your legs are stiff, your sandals wet, and your understanding of ancient Egyptian taxation slightly more absurd than before. But we're not done. Not even close. You follow your guide up a narrow dirt path that winds past humble homes, the kind built from sun-baked mud brick, their walls etched with time and soot. Here lies the heart of Egypt's rural economy. Village life, the quiet engine behind all those temples, pharaohs, and floating audits. These villagers, farters, basket weavers, brewers, weren't just the backbone of society, they were its primary taxpayers. And here's the catch, they paid in everything but coin, barley, baskets, even the occasional sack of dried locusts if demand was unusually high. You duck into the low doorway of a communal storage hut. Inside, it smells like grain and sweat and old clay, taxes in raw, earthy form. You pass a scribe kneeling beside a tall ledger scroll, muttering measurements under his breath as he prods a pile of onions. Onions, your guide says, were basically a tax bracket of their own. He's not wrong. Onions were sacred, medicinal, and borderline magical in Egyptian law. Workers building the pyramids weighed partly in onions, and priests offered them in temple rites. So naturally, they became taxable assets. You imagine trying to negotiate your dues based on how many layers your onions had. That could get tearful. Historians still debate whether villagers inflated their debts to avoid harsher conscriptions. Your guide adds. In other words, claim you're broke, and maybe you don't drafted into Pharaoh's canal project next season. You stroll into a thatched kitchen where a woman grins flour beside a toddler who's chewing the corner of a reed mat. She glances up, nods politely, and points to a jar of sour beer. That's the brewer's tax. Your guide whispers. Yes, sour beer. Made from half-baked bread and fermented in open jars. It sounds like a dare, but in reality it was liquid wages, and taxable. Inspectors would visit, taste the batch and write notes like, acceptable but flat, partial credit given. In years when grain harvests failed or flooding ruined the irrigation ditches, villagers often paid with labor instead. It was called korv, a fancy word for, you owe us, so start digging. This unpaid workforce repaired canals, hauled stone, and rebuilt temples. Also, their tax debt wouldn't balloon like a badly wrapped mummy. You peek into a dim courtyard where men are shaping bricks under the moonlight. Some taxes were paid in these. Your guide says. Unbaked mud brick was both currency and contribution. You reach down to touch one. Still warm, slightly squishy, definitely unfit for pocket change. One particularly strange record from the Old Kingdom mentions a village paying their entire annual tax in grease. Animal fat, to be precise. Used for lamps cooking and ritual anointing. Makes you wonder what kind of scribe had to count tubs of goo in the summer heat. And then there were the chickens, or rather, geese, ducks, and the occasional sacred ibis. Feathers were sometimes accepted as partial payment for temple offerings, though you suspect that's the tax collector's version of, I just like birds. A curious fact, villagers were allowed to prepay their taxes in some regions. Like Netflix, your guide jokes, but with onions and bricks instead of streaming. Miss a payment, you might lose land access or worse, get named on a public shame tablet. Yes, public shame tablets existed. Clay or limestone slabs listing who hadn't paid. Ancient receipts. With attitude, you reach a well at the edge of the village. Two boys are hauling water with shoulder poles, and beside them, a small statue of a hippo goddess watches in silence. Offerings are piled at her feet. Flowers, coins, even what looks like a carved fig. You wonder if the statue is taxed too. Suddenly your guide stops and points a peculiar tree with waxy leaves and an odd, almost cinnamon-like aroma. That, he says dramatically, is the tax tree. You blink. The what? It's a local term. The sap was used in perfumes, and the flowers brewed into calming oils. Extremely valuable. So of course, the tax rate on villagers who lived near these trees was suspiciously higher. Turns out, proximity to valuable natural resources could raise your dues, even if you didn't harvest them. Like being taxed for living near a spa you can't afford to enter. Historians still argue whether these rural taxes push villagers to barter more creatively or just lie better. Your guide says. Either way, everyone learned to negotiate. But by now, the stars are out, scattered above the flat rooftops like tiny whispers. Somewhere nearby, a priest chants to the moon, and a cat strolls past with an air of divine entitlement. You lean against a pillar, staring into the soft dark, and imagine what it must have been like to live here. A world where your taxes could be measured in leaks, where your debt might be forgiven with a well-timed goose, where public shame came in limestone form and a half jug of beer was legal tender. You smile, despite yourself, because somehow, it worked. You wake, figuratively of course, to the rising sun brushing its golden fingers across the Nile delta. Morning here begins not with the crow of a rooster, but the low, a rhythmic splash of water carriers, and the muffled thud of mortars grinding grain. There's an easy rhythm to it all, as if the very act of living is another offering to the gods. You stretch your legs beneath the woven mat you slept on, then glance up at a sight that would have been the envy of ancient accountants everywhere in the regional granary compound. Yes, you're about to step inside the buzz center of Egypt's taxation economy, where the actual loot was sorted, stored, and occasionally, sneakily nibbled. This particular compound is ringed by walls made of mud brick and stone, studded with columns inscribed with administrative decrees. Inside, massive silos loom like fat towers, each with narrow openings at the top and carved spouts near the base. The air smells like warm grain, papyrus ink, and a bit of goat. And here's the key fact: in grain was everything. Currency, insurance, temple offering, pension plan. If Egypt had stock markets, they'd have tracked wheat. You watch as workers, lean, dust-covered, quick with their hands, haul sacks of barley on their shoulders. A scribe stands nearby, stylus in one hand, expression halfway between focused and deeply bored. He marks each delivery on a scroll so long it could double as a dinner runner. Your guide leans in. Each tax-paying farmer had a grain fingerprint. How much he owed, when, and in what quality. Historians still debate whether some of these scribes took bribes to fudge the numbers. Some scrolls show strangely generous assessments, always from villagers near the scribe's birthplace. Coincidence? Or a little ancient nepotism? You trail behind a group of workers into a dark corridor flanked by pigeonhole shelves. This is where aromatic goods, resins, oils, perfumes, are stored. Carefully labeled, absurdly fragile, and unbelievably valuable. In fact, some perfume extracts like Kifi were worth more than their weight in gold. One clerk unseals a clay jar and waves the lid under your nose. You nearly fall backward. The scent is thick, resinous and sweet, with notes of honey, cinnamon, and something smoky. Apparently, this specific blend was used in temple offerings, healing balms, and high-level tax swaps. That's right, perfume as official tax tender. And not just any perfume. These were blends guarded like state secrets. Recipes for sacred oils were often committed to temple walls, not scrolls, possibly to discourage forgery or over-curious auditors. You overhear a manager arguing with a young assistant who mislabeled a jug of moringa oil as fish emulsion. That's the kind of error that could start a very aromatic civil war. A curious tidbit: some oils were so sacred, they could only be taxed once purified by a priest. Imagine your accountant needing a holy water bath before calculating your deductions. You step into a side room where a temple liaison is inspecting textile offerings. Not quite taxes, but very close cousins. In-kind donations often doubled as a sort of voluntary tax. Provided your voluntary choice wasn't motivated by fear of a divine backhand. Nearby, a wall lists delivery failures in a dry but quietly damning script. Lot spoiled by humidity. Ox expired in transit. Scribe fainted mid-record. You suspect some excuses haven't changed in 4,000 years. Historians still argue whether the grain collected in these silos was fairly redistributed. Your guide says as you exit the granary, brushing flour off your robe, or whether temple elites skimmed the good stuff before passing the rest down. Outside, you're nearly knocked over by a line of geese. A man holding a tally stick shoos them forward with a fan made of reeds. Temple does, he says without breaking stride. Yes, even geese had a processing protocol. You follow the birds to a courtyard where items are graded, not unlike a farmer's market run by very serious librarians. Tax items are inspected, sniffed, weighed, poked, and sometimes licked. One inspector frowns at a jar of honey and mumbles, "Too runny." The tax is rejected. Back to the farmer it goes. Quality mattered. A lot. Because the temples and state didn't just store goods, they relied on them to function. Rotten fish, a public health hazard. Spoiled oil, a ritual disaster. Unripe figs, sacrilege in snack form. But it wasn't just what you paid, it was how you delivered it. Some items were packed in woven baskets sealed with a family mark. Others, like bread, were placed in hand-painted amphoroi. You spot one basket with the word, "Absolutely fresh," written in hieratic script. Ancient marketing. In one corner of the yard, two scribes are deep in debate. One claims a tax was overcounted. The other accuses him of poor handwriting. Nearby, a temple cat yawns dramatically, as if it's seen this squabble play out too many times. You lean against a column carved with an image of the goddess Mat. Balance, truth, and order. Ironically appropriate. Because beneath the dust and squabbling, this whole system, messy, fragrant, oddly bureaucratic, held Egypt together for centuries. And here's something to chew on: none of this required money. No coins. No wallets. Just goods hands. And a shared belief that your sack of barley could become a priest's meal, a scribe's ink, or a blessing from Ra himself. You squint toward the Nile, shimmering in the distance. A boat is arriving with more tax grain from the south. Another delivery. Another day in a system where taxes weren't hated, exactly. They were expected. Like the flood or mosquitoes, or uncles overstaying their welcome. You shake your head and smile. Ancient Egypt, where your local IRS agent might also be your high priest, your bread baker, and your neighbor. You rub your hands together as you step from the courtyard into a shaded side hall, thick with incense and bustling with the soft shuffle of papyrus sandals. Here lies the part of taxation few people think abouting. What happened to all the stuff once it was collected? Egypt's economy wasn't just on collecting taxes. It thrived on reallocating them, often in surprising, roundabout ways. You're now standing in one of the state redistribution chambers, where goods are sorted not just for storage, but for purposeful use. Sent back out to pay laborers, feed temple workers, supply royal construction sites, or stock state granaries for lean flood years. A kind of economic recycling plant, if you will, just with a lot more cats and a lot less plastic. To your left, a supervisor is allocating sacks of lentils and wheat to an outgoing shipment for pyramid maintenance crews. No, they weren't slaves. That's a modern myth. Most of Egypt's large-scale projects were powered by seasonal laborers, paid, fed, and even granted leave. You spot a slip of papyrus tied to one sack that reads co. For Komombo, 2 weeks rations for work crews. Your nose twitches as a new scent wafts by, dried fish and garlic paste. Apparently, this batch is destined for garrison outposts along the eastern border. You wince sympathetically. Even by ancient standards, that's a rough meal. Historians still argue whether the redistribution process was tightly regulated or more loosely coordinated by overlapping temple and state networks. The record keeping, while detailed in some places, gets suspiciously vague in others. Missing shipments, clerical errors, or someone just having a little side hustle with royal perfume. You pause at a tall display case housing ancient measuring jars, each marked with unit names like Hecat and Hin. The standardization is impressive, though experts debate how consistent these measures actually were outside temple precincts. It's possible Icat in Thebes poured a little heavier than one in Memphis, much like how coffee sizes vary wildly depending on the barrister's mood. A young acolyte passes you, arms full of linen bolts, Egypt's other tax superstar, lightweight, versatile, and usable for every from clothing to bandages to ritual offerings. Textiles were both currency and comfort, and in some years, farmers paid entirely in lin if grain yields were poor. You trail the acolyte to the temple distribution chamber, where priests are souting goods for sacred ceremonies. The room is fragrant with spices and floral oils. Perfumed cons rest in trays beside loaves shaped like birds, fish, and flowers. Bread art, essentially baked not for taste but for gods. Fun facting, some temples paid their own staff in the very bread and beer that worshippers donated as tax. You imagine showing up to your shift and being handed a paycheck in the form of 3 warm rolls and a jug of barley brew. Not bad, unless you had rent due in geese. One clerk grumbles as he tries to balance 2 tall amphorae on a reed pallet. It's always the sesame oil. Never travels well. You're tempted to help, but the floor is suspiciously slick with spillage, and you're not in the mood to reenact an ancient banana peel gag. Further inside the chamber, a delegation of administrators from a nearby no provincial governor is reviewing inventory for their district. They're arguing, softly but passionately, about the exact weight of a dried date bundle. The tension is palpable, like watching 2 modern officials bicker over spreadsheet formatting. There's a system of receipts and ledgers in place here, carved on tablets or scrawled on papyrus. But the real currency is trust. If a shipment goes missing en route to a royal workshop, was it bandits, flood, clerical mix-up, or somewhere, decided that maybe this batch of frankincense would smell better burning in their own living room? Historians still argue whether temple distributions were more fair than secular ones. Some believe temple staff were more accountable due to spiritual oversight. Others argue that having a god as your boss was the perfect excuse to do whatever you wanted and claim divine approval. Oh, yes, the ibis-shaped bread was for truth, of course. That's why I took 2. As you lean on a wall carved with distribution records, your eye catches an amusing little drawing, a monkey stealing a loaf from a priest's tray, while a cat watches in lazy judgment. Even ancient record keepers needed a bit of comic relief. Now you're ushered to a smaller chamber, a cooler and more fragrant. This is where the finest goods are held before being parceled out to elite artisans, scholars, or physicians in service to the royal court. Small jars of honey, stacks of dyed linen, and even a few jars labeled, for embalming purposes only, sit in neat rows. You decide not to ask what's inside those last ones. In one corner, a ledger records perfume allocations to temple dancers, a reminder that not all state-supported labor was hauling bricks or baking bread. Egypt's tax-supported economy included the arts. You might have paid taxes in barley, and that barley might have eventually bought a jasmine-scented performance beneath the temple moon. You sigh. There's something oddly beautiful about it. This system, for all its flaws and bureaucratic tangles, wove together farmers, scribes, dancers, bakers, and gods in a shared web of exchange. Your barley didn't just feed the nation. It became the nation, reborn with each careful redistribution, and as you watch an elderly scribe seal another record scroll with a dab of honey wax, you get the sense he knows it too. The moment your feet hit the sun-warmed flagstones again, you're gently herded toward a more private wing of the complex, the kind with fewer baskets and more eyebrows raised in quiet disapproval. This, dear traveller, is where Egypt's elite tax collectors gathered, debated, and occasionally squabbled over who owed what, and whether or not someone's offering of a slightly rancid goat counted as fair payment. You duck under a lintel etched with falcons and hieroglyphic warnings about honest record keeping. A bit rich, considering what you're about to witness. Welcome to the bureaucratic heart of redistribution, the place where tax ledgers get finalized, and numbers become either national stability or bureaucratic chaos. A young scribe waves you inside. His hands are stained with ink, his expression somewhere between exhaustion and smugness. He's clearly been up all night copying figures into a massive grain inventory scroll. You peek over his shoulder. Neat columns line the papyrus, each detailing tax contributions from dozens of villages, measured in hecats, noted down with obsessive care and the occasional doodle of a frog in a top hat. Bureaucracy has its boredom. After all, historians still argue whether these records were centralized or kept locally. Some evidence suggests the central administration received updates from regional scribes, while other records seem to contradict that entirely. The truth may lie somewhere in between, a sort of organized chose the ancient Egyptians simply called Wednesday. To your right, two tax offers debate the proper conversion rate between barley and labdanum resin used in incense. You catch phrases like regional variance, adjusted tribute weights, and what do you mean the goat at the invoice? It's oddly comforting. Bureaucrats have clearly been inventing new forms of stress since 2500 BCE. You're ushered past a large wall map of Egypt carved in relief, each nome, or province, marked with its primary taxed specialty as flax here, fish there, honeycomb way down south. You tap the linen-rich area with your finger. A scribe nods knowingly. Good quality there. High thread count. Tough on the looms. And near the back of the room stands an older administrator with a particularly long feather quill and the unshakable aura of Soban who knows exactly how powerful their red ink is. He's signing off on a shipment of wine bound for the royal granaries. Taxed from vineyard-owning estates in the Delta, this wine isn't for drinking, yet. It's destined for storage, eventual redistribution to temples or festivals, or possibly even for export. Everything flows in and out. The administrator mutters as he scribbles a note. Tax his breath. Inhale the grain, exhale the perfume. You can't tell if he's being putic or just a little wine-scented himself. You sit for a moment at one of the record tables, brushing your fingers across a ledger made not of papyrus but limestone sherds, called ostraca. Broken pottery bits made excellent scratch paper, especially for everyday records or test calculations. One scribe left an entire comedic letter to a friend on a shard. It ends with, "If you bring lentils again, I'm moving to Nubia." A dispatch rider enters the chamber, dropping off scrolls from a southern province. There's a mild panic. Someone forgot to include the official seal. That means these otherwise legitimate records may now be rejected, forcing the entire town to resubmit its tax data. You watch the stress settle over the scribes like a sandstorm on laundry day. One particularly flustered clerk mutters that the local officials must have forgotten to bribe the courier again. You raise an eyebrow, but he just shrugs. Some things work faster with beer. Historians still argue whether bribery was systemic or incidental. Certainly, it wasn't enshrined in law, but many suggest small gifts helped move things along, especially when dealing with priests who smelled better than most gods. In a quieter corner of the room, a high-ranking temple account is settling a delicate matter, translating a deceased nobler woman's estate into tax-exempt religious donations. It's part legal, part spiritual, and all very hush-hush. The perfumed oil she once hoarded now technically belong to Hartha. Whether they'll actually make it to the shrine or end up softening a priest's elbow skin is, well, open for interpretation. This leads the conversation naturally to debt and deferral. If someone couldn't pay in full, say, a year of poor flooding, they might negotiate installment plans, pledging next season's harvest or livestock offspring. But there were limits. Miss too many payments, and your fields could be reassigned to someone more tax reliable. Harsh, but efficient. One case, pinned to the wall, tells the story of a fisherman who tried to pay his June fresh eels, claiming they were sacred to Sobek and therefore invaluable. The administrator's response, preserved forever in ink, was, "Then let Sobek feed you this year." You can't help but chuckle. At your feet, a cat curls itself into a perfect semicircle on a sack of counted lentils. It blinks at you with that unbothered feline expression suggesting it, too, is part of the bureaucracy, perhaps even running it. Back near the entryway, two scribes begin arguing over how to mark a payment in perfumed cones, those waxy blobs worn on the head during ceremonies. Was it equivalent to minna, or should it be taxed as a luxury? The answer seems to depend less on policy and moron who has the longer lunch break coming. And finally, as the sun begins to stretch shadows across the floor, the chamber slowly empties out. Scrolls are tucked into reed baskets, ink pots closed with cloth. The final scribe yawns, leaves a note for himself on a broken tile, check fish receipts, and slips into the hallway. You stay behind a moment longer, listening to the quiet. These were not warriors or kings or prophets, but they kept the Nile economy flowing with meticulous ink strokes and tired eyes. And as far as economic marvels go, it's one that deserves a little awe. By now, your sandals are worn thin, and you're trailing the smell of ancient ink and barley dust. But don't get too comfortable. Tonight's journey through the Egyptian tax machine has one more left turn. You follow a painted corridor lit by oil lamps, their glow flickering against the plaster like sleepy fireflies. The next door opens not into another archive, but into a place that smells distinctly of roses. Welcome to the temple storerooms. Sacred, fragrant, and surprisingly well organized. This is where much of the tax-paid perfume, incense, and temple line ends up, tucked into labeled baskets or clay jars, guarded by men who look like they haven't blinked since the reign of Khufu. Here, offerings blend with taxation. It's not always clear where spiritual devotion ends and economic obligation begins. You pass by shelves stacked with jars of kifi, a sweet, smoky incense blend made from myrrh, wine, raisins, honey, and spices. This stuff wasn't just burned for the gods. It was also a favorite remedy for insomnia and bad dreams. Yes, even ancient priests had their share of sleep troubles. Maybe it's all the accounting. One old priest nods as you pass. He's checking a scroll that lists recent contributions from local estates. One family delivered 4 jars of rose oil, 1 line sheet, and something described only as, not quite comin'. There's a small note in the margin. Still smells funny. Historians still argue whether these temple goods were solely for ritual use, or if some found their way back into elite households. Temples controlled vast land holdings, often functioning like miniature governments with their own storage, labor forces, and, let's be honest, gossip networks. At the far end of the chamber sits a shrine to Thoth, god of scribes. Before him lies a polished offering bowl covered in tax-paid goods, alabaster jars, garlic bulbs braided like necklaces, miniature loaves of bread stacked in geometric precision. You pause here, not out of pity but out of sheer curiosity. Did some poor farmer really haul this garlic 10 miles on foot just to meet a quota? Apparently yes. And not just garlic. Behind another curtain lies a storeroom filled with taxed textiles, rolled linen bolts carefully weighed and folded. Some are plain, for mummification or wrapping food. Others are dyed in rare indigo, taxed heavily as luxury items. You touch the edge of one bolt. It's so finely woven it might pass for silk in the moonlight. A nearby scribe is busy weighing perfumed cones, those waxy domes that melted slowly on celebrants' heads during banquets. He's muttering something about moisture content skewing the tax value. You don't interrupt. Clearly this is serious business. It's worth pausing here to appreciate just how important smell was to ancient Egyptians. To them, the pleasant aromas weren't just luxury. They were holy currency. Cleanliness and scent were seen as direct links to the divine. That made perfume both a status symbol and a tax item, depending on who wore it. In a quiet alcove, 2 young novices are labeling small alabaster bottles. The scent wafting up is unmistakable lotus, that dreamy aquatic flower beloved by the elite. Its oil was painstakingly extracted through pressing and steeping. One jar could represent a week's tax obligation for a mid-tier merchant. Naturally, some tried to cut corners. One hilarious fragment in the archives reads, "The oil smells of onion." We are not amused. As you move deeper into the storerooms, the goods grow stranger. One chest contains taxed coal, the eye makeup worn by everyone from pharaohs to fishermen. Not just for vanity. Coal was believed to ward off infection and evil spirits. You wonder whether some poor soul once tried to argue that his makeup was medicinal, and thus exempt. There's also a crate of dried fish, pungent but prized. Some taxes were paid in preserved catfish or mullet, especially in marshy districts. One receipt you glimpse details. 2 baskets, overly salted, good for temple cats. You chuckle. Even the feline priests got their due. Next to the fish sits a stack of reed mats, used for everything from flooring to prayer rituals. Though technically utilitarian, they were taxed as well, especially if decorated or dyed. One mat here shows a clumsy rendering of the Nile gods playing Senate, with the caption, "Osiris always cheats." You try not to laugh too loudly. Historians still argue whether this blending of tax, worship, and household utility made for a stronger economy, or simply a more confusing one. On one hand, it was efficient. On the other, it meant the same jar of could be a temple offering, a royal tax, or someone's bribe to a neighbor, depending on how it was labeled. Some things never change. Toward the back wall, you find a collection of receipts written in red and black ink. Red for headings, black for body text. One in particular catches your eye. It's a record of a noblewoman who, in lieu of paying in goods, donated 3 singers to the temple chair for a season. The receipt notes their names and voices. One soprano, one contralto, one speaks only in riddles. That, you decide, is peak bureaucracy. Eventually, the scent of frankincense and ancient wood becomes almost hypnotic. You lean against a storage bin full of barley loaves and imagine a tax collector from the 3,000 years ago doing exactly this. Cataloguing jars, checking weights, trying not to sneeze into the incense. And just when you think you've seen it all, a young boy arrives with today's last, offering a small clay jar labeled, "Blessed Ostrich Fat, 1 portion." You don't ask, you simply nod, and back quietly out of the room. You step back into the cooler corridor, the perfume-soaked air still clinging faintly to your robe. As you walk, you begin to notice a change. Not in direction, but in tone. The sound of measured voices echo softly through the stone hallway ahead, like waves lapping against bureaucratic cliffs. You're approaching one of the most underrated forces in Egyptian history, the women who worked the tax system. Yes, brace yourself. The ancient Egyptian economy wasn't just scroll-wielding men with dramatic eyeliner. Women were in it too, recording, producing, paying, and sometimes dodging their dues with the best of them. The first room you enter is quiet, lined with papyrus scrolls and a few chipped statues of lion-headed goddesses. A scribe glances up, surprised by your dusty arrival, and gestures to a seated figure at the far end. She's surrounded by open documents and a curious smell, perhaps cedar oil and ambition. She's one of many female landowners in ancient Egypt, and she's here to settle her property taxes. You sit nearby, pretending to read a receipt. She's cool and composed, her lines spotless, her gold earrings glinting just enough to make a point. She owns fields along the Nile's eastern bend, papyrus plots and grain silos, passed down from her mother. That's not a fluke. In ancient Egypt, women could inherit land, initiate contracts, and manage estates without needing a husband's permission. Pharaohs may have been male by default, but middle-class Egyptian society had plenty of women calling the shots. The woman signs with a reed pen and nods to the scribe, who hands her a receipt, a neat symbol scratched in red at the bottom, and the eye of Horus, watching all. As she leaves, the clerk rolls up the document and seals it with mud. You're tempted to follow her. She probably has better snacks than the temple's storeroom. Next door, a linen merchant named Citro is carefully unwrapping bolts of dyed cloth, her yearly tax offering. She's talkative. Too talkative, perhaps, but she lets slip that she sometimes adds a strip of cheaper weave at the end of each bolt. Just a little trick, she says, for the blind inspectors. You raise an eyebrow. She shrugs. They can't feel thread count through bureaucracy. Historians still argue whether these kinds of domestic adjustments were widespread or exceptional. Did inspectors overlook Citra's little swap-outs, or did they quietly expect a bribe in return for silence? Either way, she's not losing sleep over it. Her cat, draped over a basket of indigo scraps, certainly isn't. You wander into another room where a middle-aged woman is supervising a group of children as they count out onions and garlic for temple dues. She's a widow, but that doesn't mean she's outside the system. In fact, widows often had significant legal independence and could represent themselves in court or before tax officials. The kids are noisy though. One tries to sneak an onion for lunch and gets a sharp look from his grandmother. "Pay first, eat later," she mutters. A teenage girl enters carrying a basket of perfume bottles, giggling nervously. She's delivering on behalf of her aunt, a perfumer known in the village for her signature blend of lotus, minna, and a pinch of something secret. The tax collector accepts the offering but asks for a second bottle. "For official purposes," he says. The girl hands it over, whispering, "Good luck sleeping through this one." It lingers. And throughout the corridors you find more evidence of female economic presence. Property contracts written in their names, scribes trained by priestesses, even letters from women requesting tax delays due to flooding or illness. Some get extensions, some don't. Bureaucracy, it seems, doesn't bend easily, even for a tear-stained scroll. One case stands out. A noblewoman, Henatui, is cited for paying her taxes in scented line and trained dancers. Not unheard of, but what's odd is the note at the bottom. Dancers did not arrive on time. Payment delayed. Line satisfactory. You imagine the official furrowing his brow, wondering how to log tardy choreography on a balance sheet. You pause at a carved wall relief depicting an estate scene, women directing workers, weighing grain, leading donkeys laden with baskets. It's not temple propaganda, just everyday tax reality. In a system this complex, where goods flowed instead of coins, every capable adult became a node in the network. Men, women, and children all contributed, directly or through clever substitutions. Some households even had informal accountants, often literate wives or daughters keeping track of goods owed and received. One letter fragment reads, "The barley is short. Tell Pesa we must send honey instead. Also Tia says not to forget the sandal tax." Practical, efficient, slightly passive-aggressive, just right. Still, not every woman had leverage. Tenant farmers' wives often paid with hard labor, working harvest fields in exchange for rent. spinning thread for temple textile quotas, or grinding grain to meet bread requirements. One touching record describes a mother delivering a tax loaf shaped like a tiny crocodile. For the scribe's amusement, bribery, but wholesome. Historians still debate how equal the system really was. Yes, the legal rights of Egyptian women were stronger than in many ancient societies, but enforcement, access to scribes, and proximity to temple power likely skewed the odds. Some had voice and choice, others had only onions and hope. You pass one last chamber, where 3 women sit folding textiles into orderly stacks. They hum softly, a lullaby older than papayas. One of them glances up, smiles faintly, and returns to her work. You linger, listening. For a moment, everything slows. Lynn Russell's oil lamps flicker, and in that stillness, you feel how much of this system was held together not by kings or overseers, but by quiet, competent hands like hers. You leave the textile room behind, trailing the scent of cedar oil and quiet competence, and descend a narrow staircase that spirals gently down toward the banks of the Nile. The light shifts as you go, less temple torchlight now, more of that dreamy, dusky blue that floats just above the water in the hour before night. Here, along the canals and silty roads, is where the most curious species of tax life flourished in the middleman. You step off the final stair into a space bustling with movement. Donkeys shuffle past with baskets of dried figs. Fishermen unload sacks of salted perch. And in the shade of a tamarisk tree, 2 men argue over the true weight of a date cluster. No one here wears gold collars or crisp lined tunics. Their garments are patched and sun-bleached, their sandals lopsided, and their ledgers, if they even have any, are probably chalked onto pottery shards. You've arrived in the heart of the tax subcontracting world, where scribes and overseers didn't collect directly from every villager. Instead, they relied on these dusty intermediaries, grain counters, temple messengers, regional officials with excellent memories and questionable ethics. A man with a crooked smile and the confidence of someone who always arrives late and still gets his way offers you a palm-sized cake from the surplus, he says, not specifying whether it's his surplus or someone else's. He's a tax broker, not an official government agent, but close enough to act like one. He collects taxes from villagers in kind, keeps a little off the top, and deliver rest to the temple warehouse with a flourish. Efficient, he calls it. Entrepreneurial, his neighbors grumble. Historians still argue whether these middlemen helped stabilize the system or introduced the earliest forms of bureaucratic corruption. Possibly both. Likely both. He gestures toward a pile of tax receipts, etched on ostraca. Broken pottery pieces repurposed for daily accounting. You pick one up. It reads, 2 jars honey, half sound. 1 goat, not entirely tame. Accepted. There's a smudged thumbprint at the bottom. Good enough, apparently. Around the corner, you find a young woman selling fragrant garlic strings, already peeled. Better for counting. She winks. Turns out peeling onions and garlic before offering them as tax was a common courtesy, and a sneaky way to avoid claims of hidden rot. One time, she says, my neighbor slipped a pebble into a bulb, claimed it was naturally dense. The scribe wasn't amused. You follow a delivery trail along the riverbank, where goods are stacked for inspection. Some bundles are labeled in red inker, from House of Mena. Inspect thoroughly. Others simply bear a seal and a frown. The inspectors, a skeptical group armed with weighted stones and a deep distrust of human honesty, begin their rounds. You watch one reject a basket of barley because it smells too sweet. Tempting the gods, he mutters. You're not sure if he means it literally. Nearby, a man is singing a tax tally aloud, while his apprentice scratches numbers into a plank of wood with a nail. 83 loaves, -3 eaten by mice, plus 2 jars of beer warm. His rhythm is hypnotic. You lean against a post and almost doze off before the apprentice pokes you with a nail. You counting too? He asks. You nod, vaguely. Always, you whisper. In a side alley, someone has painted a cartoonish figure of a scribe with an exaggerated nose and a giant reed pen poking villagers. Below it, may your scales always tilt. Bureaucracy, satire, ancient edition. Despite the grumbling, the tax network worked because it was relentlessly local. Each small official understood the rhythms of their village, who grew what, when the river rose, which family had fallen ill. This hyper-local knowledge meant that adjustments were often unofficially sanctioned. A family with a sick of ox might be allowed to substitute geese. A brewer low on barley might pay in sweet date beer instead, though whether the collector passed that substitution along to the temple, well, that's where the guessing begins. A fisherman wanders up with a basket of dried eels looking sheepish. I missed last month's quota, he mumbles. Storm caps my net. The inspector sniffs the basket and shrugs. Tell your neighbor to vouch for you next time. That's another tax quirk, collective responsibility. If your house defaulted, your neighbors might be expected to cover the gap. Social harmony, enforced through peer pressure and shared onions. You stroll past a stall selling jars dyed different colors, each labeled in hasty hieratic. These are the containers used to transport scented oils as tax. Blue for myrrh, red for lotus, green for frankincense blends. Don't mix them up. The vendor warns. 3 days ago, one time we sent frankincense marked as Sadar. The priest sneezed for a week. You wonder if that's really why frankincense was banned in this region for 3 years. Historians still wonder how much of this tax economy was formalized versus improvised. Were there written manuals for substitutions? Or did each region invent its own customs as it went along? The lack of centralized coins means flexibility was key, but also messy. You can't help but think, somewhere in the royal archives, there's probably a scroll titled, Acceptable Forms of Garlic. But by the time you reach the far end of the canal, dusk has melted fully into night. The inspectors pack up, the brokers tally their slices, and the villagers return home, a little relieved. You stand beside a boat being loaded with a mixture of foodstuffs and perfume flasks. Bound for the temple, you don't need to guess what it smells like. You know by now. The boat rocks gently as it's poled away from the village dock, gliding upriver toward the looming silhouette of the temple compound. You hitch a ride, squatting between baskets of lentils and ceramic jars filled with scented unguents, probably destined for the priests' bathhouses or ritual anointings. The air is thick with warm river breeze and the musky undertones of dried fish. You think, not for the first time, that no tax auditor has ever smelled this many competing aromas at once. The man pulling the boat is humming, mostly to himself, occasionally to the crocodiles. They don't like loud splashes. He offers, deadpan. You don't want to make them curious. Fair enough. You decide to avoid all sudden movements. You also make a mental note to never get taxed in fish. Nothing attracts crocodiles faster than a leaky basket of Nile perch. Up ahead, the temple grows larger with each passing breath. Not just a single building, but a complex ecosystem in granaries, oil presses, writing rooms, incense stores, livestock pens, and yes, the tax warehouses, where your boat's cargo is headed. If the villages are the bloodstream of Egypt's economic body, the temple is its beating heart. Everything flows inward. Everything gets recorded. You dock beside a sloped ramp, slick with clay, where laborers unload the offerings with practiced efficiency. One man jots something on an ostrakon, balancing it on his thigh like a clipboard. Another lifts a jug, sniffs, and nods. Apparently it passed the scent test. A third man grogs as he sack of onions off the boat, muttering something about pyramid back syndrome. Inside the warehouse compound, things become less aromatic and more bureaucratic. Scrolls are unrolled, tallies are verified, and God's help you if your perfume jar doesn't match the reed label attached to it. Last week, one warehouse scribe tells you, someone submitted oil labeled sacred lotus, but it was just pressed turnip, a crime against the nostrils. You follow him deeper into the building, where rows of sealed amphorae stretch into the dark, each one daubed with symbols denoting its contents and tax origin. Some are covered in dust, others still damp from transport. This one's from Elephantine, he says, patting a jug reverently. Finest date wine in the south, used to bribe tax officials when they're grumpy. You raise an eyebrow. Allegedly, he adds quickly. In one corner of the room sits a strange collection, half-cracked baskets, a cloth bundles leaking powdered herbs, and an urn full of something that looks suspiciously like honey mixed with ash. Tax penalties, the scribe whispers. When someone messes up too badly, we don't discard the offering, we reclassify it. You nod slowly, not sure whether to be impressed or slightly horrified. Nearby, another scribe is updating a ledger of tax equivalent values. How many loaves of barley bread equal 1 jar of almond oil? How many duck eggs equal a bundle of linen? And how many bundles of papyrus equal 1 perfumed cone of myrrh wax? The numbers fluctuate depending on season, scarcity, and rumor. Sometimes, he sighs, we adjust values based on mood. Don't tell the overseer. Historians still debate the standardization of these equivalencies. Did Egypt have an official state-issued conversion chart for taxes in kind? Or was it all based on local consensus and priestly preference? There's evidence for both theories. Fragments of standardized rate scrolls have been found, but so have wildly inconsistent village tallies. One tax receipt even counts a goose, worth 5 loaves, unless particularly plump. Back in the main chamber, a group of young initiates is learning how to properly seal tax containers using wax stamps bearing the temple's mark. This one's Horus watching, says an instructor. Not the actual god, just his quality control symbol. You watch as one boy accidentally drops a seal into a jug of coriander oil. The instructor sighs, then shrugs. Smells better than most of the scribes. Outside, you notice a different kind of traffic, temple servants carrying processed goods away. Some items, like grain and line, are redistributed to soldier and public workers. Others are consumed in rituals, used in embalming, or sold in temple-run marketplaces. Tax doesn't just come in and vanish. It's converted, reoffered. It's a bit like ancient recycling, you think. Bread becomes offerings. Offerings become grain rations. Grain rations become temple construction fuel. Even used perfume jars are re-scrubbed and sent back into the system. We don't waste, a porter tells you. Unless it's lettuce. Never tax in lettuce. Wilts too fast. Near the temple kitchen, a priest explains how perfume was used in purification rituals, not just luxury. You anoint the statues, the altars, sometimes the scrolls themselves. The gods prefer good smells. He dabs your wrist with a fleck of blue lotus wax. Now the crocodiles won't find you so interesting. He smiles. You wander past another storehouse, where a dispute is brewing between two scribes over whether a recent tax shipment qualifies as ritually clean. Apparently, one of the oil jars had a crack in the neck, and there's a debate about whether the smell changed after exposure. Historians still argue whether ritual purity impacted tax receipts. One of them mutters. You chuckle. Sometimes modern historians and ancient bureaucrats sound eerily similar. As night deepens, you sit beside a pile of sealed jars, listening to the creak of reed pens and the soft murmur of scribes counting aloud. Even here, amid the ledgers and sealed amphorae, there's a certain calm to the rhythm of it all. The Nile laps against the wall just outside, patient as ever. You stretch out, using a bag of onions as a pillow, surprisingly supportive, and inhale the faint mix of myrrh, river breeze, and pencil shavings. Somewhere nearby, someone sings a hymn to Thoth, god of wisdom and writing. You let the melody carry you for a while, half asleep, entirely steeped in the strange and fragrant world of Egypt's tax warehouses. You wake to the faint clatter of scribes re-inking their pens, the warehouse alive with the soft scratch of reed tips against papyrus. Someone nearby is whispering a prayer to Seshat, goddess of accounting and architecture, probably to ensure days' tallies don't mysteriously vanish like last week's shipment of frankincense. Rubbing your eyes, you step out into the courtyard, where a fresh line of villagers has gathered, bearing new offerings, new receipts, and the same anxious expressions. You recognize the look. It's the, please don't make me redo this, face, universally worn by tax filers from Memphis to modern Manhattan. Among them stands a man clutching what appears to be a basket of dried locusts, lovingly wrapped in linen. They were a delicacy last year, he insists to the tax officer. The priests asked for them. The scribe examines the bugs, sniffs, then raises an eyebrow. We'll classify them as ceremonial snacks, he says diplomatically. Historians still argue whether food items like this were actually part of temple rituals, or just creative padding for a lighter tax season. You move on, passing a young girl holding a jar filled with what she claims is perfumed goat butter. For anointing statues, she adds with suspicious confidence. The scribe weighs it, sniffs it, tastes a dab, then shrugs. We'll mark it as partial tender, he mutters, scribbling something on her palm leaf receipt. Here at the intake station, the chaos feels a little theatrical. Everyone knows the rules, and yet everyone also tries to bend them just a little. Overstated values, mislabeled bundles, swapped perfumes. You hear one scribe mutter, that's clearly mint oil, not papyrus flower, like a perfumer's version of catching someone lying on their taxes. A few heated arguments erupt, about scent integrity, bread weight, and whether duck eggs count as livestock or luxury, but are quickly diffused with bribes of candied dates and accidental jars of pomegranate cordial. It's no coincidence that many of these tax intake scribes are trained perfumers themselves, at least informally. The finer your nose, the harder it is for people to trick you with dilute oils or scented dyes. One older scribe lets you sniff 2 jars side by side. This, he says, holding out the first, is real blue lotus. This, he pauses, unscrewing the second, is cabbage boiled with rosemary. Guess which one the fisherman tried to pass off last week. Naturally you guess wrong. You continue deeper into the temple compound, where rejected goods are reprocessed. A group of servants is boiling down spoiled honey into a kind of sticky resin, probably destined for use in low-grade incense. Nothing goes to waste. One tells you cheerfully, splattered in molasses, except that one shipment of beer-soaked linen. That was a miscommunication. Historians still debate whether temple tax goods could be resold in open markets. Some records suggest temples maintained formal stalls in local bazaars, where they offloaded surplus bread, oils and lines, likely with inflated prices. Others believe only the high priests had that privilege, and even then, it was considered taboo to sell something that had once been ritually dedicated. Either way, it's clear the economic role of temples extended far beyond worship. You wander through a shaded corridor where officials gather at midday to rest, tally scrolls in their laps, sandals off, legs stretched. One tells a jokey, and 3 tax scribes walk into a granary. You don't catch the punchline, but the group erupts in laughter, so you chuckle along. Probably something about miscounted barley. There's a kind of poetry in this processing the wax, sealed amphorae, the charcoal tally marks, the clatter of reed pens. Not glamorous, but stable, predictable, almost comforting. Taxation in ancient Egypt wasn't a dreaded annual ordeal. It was a seasonal ritual, deeply tied to religious duty and agricultural rhythm. A farmer once told you, the gods take their share through the temple, and the temple gives us flood forecasts and star charts. And he wasn't wrong. These same temples were also observatories, libraries, and schools. Pay your taxes, and you fund the astrologer who warns of locusts, the priestess who trains midwives, the archivist who tracks omens. It's not just obligation, it's ecosystem. Later that afternoon, you find yourself at a small, dusty annex behind the main warehouse, where a curious collection has been quietly gathering broken stelae, faded papyri, and oddball tax submissions that defy categorization. One entry is listed as 2 jars of dream oil, supposedly collected during a lunar eclipse. Another, cryptically, reads, 1 singing reed, a possibly enchanted, value negotiable. A wiry clerk waves you over and unrolls a scroll that tries to standardize perfume tax rates by scent category. This section, he explains, tapping a column, tries to define what qualifies as a heavenly aroma, but no one agrees. Mirror's too strong for some. Others think frankincense smells like bounce soup. He shrugs. So we compromise. If it smells expensive, it's good enough. Back near the loading docks, the boats are lining up again, this time to ship goods outward. The temple's own taxes, owed to the palace, are due soon, and that means another round of careful packing, reed tag labeling, and whispered prayers that no jug leaks en route. Even temples, it turns out, aren't exempt from the cycle. As the sun dips low behind the columns, turning the Nile to bronze, you find a quiet spot beside the perfumed storage vault. You lean back against a warm wall, ears full of the temple's buzz, and try to count how many jars of scented oil pass through this place in a year. 10,000. 100,000. You lose track somewhere around 8-7 jars of acacia blossom essence. A small breeze carries the mingled scent of bread ovens, melting wax, and the sharp tang of date vinegar from the cooking courtyard nearby. Somehow the air itself feels taxed, dense with effort, purpose, and the strange sweetness of an economy powered by things that smell nice. The Nile snores softly beside you as dawn returns in pink and gold, and already, the temple courtyard stirs with sandals scuffing stone and murmured complaints about insect bites. One man scratches at a mosquito welt and mutters something about charging the god's interest. You smile. Welcome to another day in Egypt's most fragrant accounting department. By now, you've seen the full arc of a tax cycle, harvest to offering, tally to tithe, and the gears grind on without much fuss. But today, you'll follow the goods one step further, because eventually, those jars of perfumed oil and bread don't just sit in storage, they go somewhere, specifically royal delivery. You trail a caravan preparing for departure, a row of reed carts loaded with all the usual suspects, sealed amphorae of sweet minna, baskets of barley flatbread, bolts of linen dyed in the expensive shades reserved for nobility. At the front of the caravan walks a priest, scribe humming tunelessly, clearly in charge of the paperwork, and trying to project authority despite his wine stain and slanted headdress. His name might be Hetep or possibly Seti, you're too afraid to ask again. This is the palace tithe, the share owed to Pharaoh himself. While temples collected from villagers, they in turn owed a slice to the state. Historians still argue whether the pharaoh's portion was a fixed percentage or negotiated yearly depending on political winds, but either way, it meant a constant shuffle of scented, baked, woven and pickled goods across great distances. The priest-scribe's scroll flutters in the morning breeze. You sneak a peek and find line items like 15 jars lotus oil grade B, 112 amphorae beer lemon mint, and, oddly, 1 goose, half marbled. You're not sure what marbled means in this context, but you imagine a particularly indecisive bird. As the carts creak through the temple gates and onto the Nile road, a squad of guards joins for protection. Not against bandits necessarily, though those did exist, but more often against bureaucratic interception. Rival temples or nosy governors sometimes tried to skim offerings en route. One official once claimed his guards accidentally mislaid 40 jars of cinnamon oil. They smelled so good, he explained. We followed the scent trail, right back to our own granary. You ride with the caravan a ways, enjoying the pace. The countryside blurs by in golden waves of barley stubble and grazing ibises. Villagers watch from doorways as you pass, some with wistful expressions. These goods are leaving their district. Gifts to Pharaoh, yes, but also symbols of the labor they poured into their harvest. When you reach a royal way station, everything halts. The guards tense. A group of palace accountants, looking insufferably well-rested, appears with scales, scrolls, and an air of theatrical skepticism. They poke at the lined bundles. They sniff the oils. One even bites a piece of bread, then frowns dramatically. A debate breaks out over a batch of honeyed date loaves. Too dense, says a palace clerk. Unfit for Pharaoh. The priest-scribe huffs. Their ceremonial density. An impasse. Eventually, someone compromising those loves will go to palace guards instead of the royal table. The scribe scribbles. The bread is saved from the Nile's fish. You slip around back to inspect one of the carts labeled unusual items. Here, you find the fun stuff cones of incense shaped like gazelles, beaded collars of crushed turquoise, even a jar labeled sacred swamp essence, which smells exactly like its name suggests. No one's quite sure what to do with it, but the label has a pharaoh's seal, so it goes forward. One old man explains, not without pride, pharaoh receives not just goods, but atmospheres. A jar of perfume can be a place, a memory, a spell, and you get it. These aren't just commodities, they're containers of culture. Egypt's economy doesn't run on coins, but on symbols, smells, textures, tastes. The caravan is cleared to proceed, and you travel beside it through the city gates. Here the smellscape changes. No longer bread and barley, but people and paint and hot stone. Music filters in from a nearby festival. Children run barefoot through the dust. A temple cat hops onto a cart and promptly falls asleep atop the royal mirror. You arrive at the outer walls of the palace complex, just as midday heat thickens the air. The scribes here wear sharper robes, with gold-stitched hymns and an air of permanent disapproval. They cross-check the delivery scrolls with alarming speed, their eyes scanning symbols like hawks watching mice. No one dares joke. The jars are passed, the seals checked, and a portion of the perfume is ushered into a private chamber. The royal anointing room, one assumes. You can only peek, but the smells are overwhelming: brew lotus, cinnamon bark, henna resin, something faintly citrus and warm, a scent that whispers power. Inside, a priestess sings softly over a basin. She dips her fingers in a bowl of scented oil and paints it gently across the rim of a gold mirror. This oil, likely tax paid by a fisherman's wife 2 districts away, will anoint the pharaoh's feet tonight. In this act, the entire tax system becomes sacred ritual, from field to jar to flesh. As the goods are accepted, the palace scribes reward the temple's caravan with a handful of tokens, items to carry backing rolls of papyrus, a satchel of exotic seeds, and a fresh calendar stone for next year's collection dates. The system refreshes itself. You head back down the palace steps with the caravan, feeling the day fade. One of the guards tosses you a strip of dried melon rind, sweet and chewy. You've earned it. Back at the riverbank, the carts are repacked for the return trip. The priest scribe finally relaxes, peeling off his headcloth and airing his scalp with a flourish. Only lost 1 jar this time, he says. Better than last year. That jackal stole 3. You're not sure whether he's joking. As the barge glides back toward the temple, sun dipping low behind the palms, you glance over the water's ripples and realize the economy of scent, of perfume, of bread, of symbolic goods, is a system built not just on supply and demand, but belief that these objects mean something. That paying your dues makes you part of something larger, that even a jar of fragrant goat butter might, somewhere down the line, make a god smile. You wake to the rustle of reeds and the creak of ropes. The temple dock's already humming with activity before the first full light hits the water. The caravan from yesterday is long gone, and, in its place, a new kind of hustle takes center stage: internal redistribution. Now that the palace has taken its share, the temple must decide what to do with the rest. Not all goods are burned for offerings or anointed on statues. A vast majority, especially the perfumes and foodstuffs, are repurposed to keep the enormous machinery of the temple turning. Today, you shadow one of the inner clerks, a wiry woman with a voice like gravel and a deep love for shouting at apprentices. She's called Nebet, which means lady, and she insists everyone call her that, even the high priests. She'll be your guide through the lesser-known corridors of the redistribution network, where taxes paid by farmers end up feeding scribes, perfuming mummies, and even renting donkeys. You begin in the storerooms, dim and blessedly cool. Long corridors of amphorae stretch away like a honeycomb of forgotten debt. Some jars are labeled for specific rituals, for the Feast of Opet, for incense at Lunar Temple, while others are marked for general use. One shelf is entirely devoted to gifts for visiting dignitaries, which includes jars of cedar oil, woven fans, and a large melon that's been sitting there suspiciously long. Nebet jabs a finger toward the inventory tablet. Every week, she grumbles, we audit what came in and what went out. That's how we catch thieves and lazy scribes. You glance nervously at a boy sweeping the corner. He sweeps faster. From the storerooms, she leads you into a kitchen courtyard, already bustling with heat and bread ovens. Here, tax bread is transformed into staff meals. Dozens of cook's pound dough. Twist it into spirals, sprinkle it with crushed coriander and cumin. You taste a piece. It's dry. Nebet shrugs. It's temple bread. You want luxury, go be pharaoh. One scribe sidles over with a jug and murmurs, leftover bear from the tax tithes. Not the good batch, but still lively. You sip. It's tangy, fermented with dates and spiced with something that tickles your throat. You nod appreciatively, and he beams like he just won a battle. From there, Nebet hauls you along to the scribe quarters, where offerings in kind are used to pay salaries. Kind of. Egypt doesn't use currency in the modern sense, but temple staff receive rations, goods, and special allotments based on their rank. A head scribe might be paid in perfume, fresh loaves, dried fish, and linen, while junior apprentices might get just a bowl of lentils and a slap on the back. Historians still argue whether these in-kind payments counted as formal wages or religious patronage. But either way, it smells like dinner. And yes, perfume is part of the payroll, at least in larger temples. Some senior officials receive a weekly measure of lotus oil or frankincense as part of their compensation, an aromatic symbol of their status. You watch as a priest carefully dabs oil behind his ears before heading into a sermon. He catches your look and shrugs. "Smells open the god's ears," he says, "and keep flies away." You trail Nebet next to a strange little room filled with, well, animals, not in cages, just hanging out. A goose, a donkey, a very judgmental cat, and a monkey that may or may not be named Senemat. Here, you learn that temples often loan animals for labor or ritual, tracked through a special kind of tax-based leasing system. As someone pays their taxes in animals, the temple rents those animals out. Someone else rents the donkey to carry bricks. The bricklayer pays with labor, or lentils. Lentils are cooked to meals for temple guards, and round it goes. A system built on trust, loops enough paperwork to bury a pyramid. At this point, years ago, you're losing track of where any original tax payment ended up. Was that fish oil from Henny the fisherman used to fry onions for the temple feast, or to grease a priest's sandals, or traded for beeswax to polish a statue's knees? It's all part of a complex, decentralized circulation. Less tax paid, and more energy redirected. Back in a small workshop, artisans crush herbs and petals to create more perfume from taxed ingredients. Ales are blended with temple-owned resins. Fragrances evolve, some for daily rituals, others for embalming rites. One jar, labeled Anubis Blind Strong, nearly knocks you unconscious when opened. That one's for mummies, someone explains, not for date night. A pale young girl next to you leans over a mixing bowl and drops in a curl of myrrh. She looks over and whispers, "Sometimes I dream the gods breathe through these jars." You don't laugh, you believe her. Outside, the afternoon sun slides lower, and Nebet takes you to the donation bay, where villagers voluntarily drop off extra offerings, more common than you'd think. Some come out of fear, others out of habit. A few, genuinely hoping to curry favor from the divine. "A little extra barley now," says one man, "and maybe Osiris remembers me when I'm halfway to the underworld." The donation pile is mostly modesty gold honey, a chipped copper com, a bundle of fresh mint, but it's the thought that counts. These extras are often used for festivals, children's blessings, or sent to smaller satellite temples without large tax bases. You're beginning to see the whole thing. The economy of redistribution isn't linear, it's a spiral, a scent trail that winds through homes, temples, rivers and tombs. Goods loop around, transform, fade, reappear. What begins as a loof in a farmer's hands might end up, weeks later, as a sweet-smelling prayer curling toward the rafters. Nebet claps you on the back and says, "Still think taxes are boring?" You nod sagely. "They smell better than I expected." You step into the records hall just as the evening light filters through high windows, turning the dust in the air into strands of gold. This is where the story of perfume and bread ends up, scratched onto papyrus, sealed in clay, and quietly filed away in the jaws of time. You might have thought ancient Egypt's tax system ended with collection and redistribution. But no, every jar of oil, every sack of grain, every bottle of beer has to be accounted for, down to the last onion. Because if the gods are watching, and let's face it, in Egypt, they're always watching, then somebody better be writing it down. You join the scribes, rows of hunched shoulders and ink-stained fingers, each bent over scrolls with a concentration usually reserved for heart surgery or overly complex board games. They use reeds split to a fine tip and ink made from soot or ochre, mixed with gum and dreams of early retirement. One scribe, who introduces himself as Koa, offers you a peek at his ledger. "This page," he whispers with theatrical importance, "is all fish." Sure enough, it's a list of entry as catfish, Nile perch, tilapia, collected from Hut Repit province, paid by volume and smell. You raise an eyebrow. "Smell," Ka grins. "If it Greeks, they shorted the weight. Some records are extraordinarily detailed, not just what was paid, but by whom, when, and under what celestial omen. This line," Kay says, mentions a red moon. "Means they paid late and tried blaming it on the gods." He snorts. "Nice try." The documentation is far from uniform. Some scribes are meticulous, others less so. One entry reads simply, 3 jars. Smelled nice. Paid in full. Historians still argue whether this reflects an accepted shorthand or just a lazy lunch shift. Either way, modern Egyptologists now pore over these notes like detectives in an eternal cold case. You glance at a tablet listing perfume taxes, some of which are categorized by blend, lotus, lily mix, imported punt resin, a ale with uncertain origins but divine aroma. These would be assigned values not just by volume, but rarity and association. Perfume from Punt, an ancient trade partner located somewhere near modern-day Eritrea or Somalia, was prized beyond gold. It might be taxed differently, or offered directly to temple statues. And yes, even the statues have ledgers. You're led past a locked room filled with clay ceilings, small lumps once pressed over storage jar stoppers, imprinted with officials' rings. Each one tells you something: the product, the origin, the official who signed off. If perfume was found leaking from an unsealed jar, that was a scandal. If a loaf of taxed bread had no seal, into the pig bucket. You're invited to watch a rare moment, the archival ritual. Once a ledger is full, it's gently rolled, tied with cord, stamped with wax, and stored in a special chamber cooled by river stones and shadow. This one, a priest whispers, records 3 years of taxes from the incense route. There's a kind of reverence to it, as if each scroll is a prayer, because in a way it is. It's a written promising that something given was received, that something owed was offered, that someone out there was trying to play fair with the divine. You ask about theft. Surely, some of these goods went missing. Of course they did. Kerr waves a hand. There's always leakage, and bribery, and cousin favoring. But if it wasn't in the ledger, it didn't exist. That's the law of papyrus. There are even documents known as tax apologies, where citizens try to explain why they couldn't meet their quotas. One man cites a bad flood. Another claims his goats got into the beer. A third, rather charmingly, writes that his wife birthed twins and he forgot the month entirely. The temple responded with grace egg, penalty reduced. But next time remember the calendar. Among the oldest scrolls is a legend, possibly apocryphal, of a scribe named Iri, who catalogued every taxed perfume in Thebes for 23 years straight. They say when he died, his tomb smelled faintly of frankincense. Scholars debate whether this was tribute or just years of inhalation. Either way, he's remembered with unusual fondness. Not everything is recorded on papyrus, as some taxes are etched directly into walls or stela. Near the temple's edge, you spot one such carving, a pictograph of a man with a bag of onions standing next to a deity with an amused expression. The caption translates loosely: Tog, he paid. But barely. There are seasonal scrolls, regional scrolls, priest-specific scrolls, weather-affected scrolls. The bureaucracy, you realize, was its own kind of religion. Not one of worship, but of remembrance, of keeping track. Because if someone wrote it down, then it meant someone, somewhere, would be held accountable. By God, Pharaoh, or neighbor. Even as the sun dips and torches are lit, the scribes keep writing. A boy brings in fresh water and more ink cakes. Ku dips his brush, yawns and murmurs. Bread and perfume. Simple things, yeah. But stack enough scrolls about Yem, and suddenly it's the backbone of the kingdom. You nod, watching the scroll in front of him take form. Grain by grain, jar by jar. A civilization scribbled down in quiet strokes and tired eyes. A place where the scent of lotus and the crumb of barley might echo in eternity, if someone remembered to file it. The Nile laps lazily at the docks as you take your final walk through this ancient world of counted loves and fragrant taxes. The air is warm and thick with the mingling smells of crushed herbs, drying papyrus, and that ever-present hint of temple incense. Like someone spilled a bottle of sandalwood on the idea of time itself. Your feet trace a familiar path now. You've walked through fields and storage rooms, sat with scribes, smelled the oil of queens and the bread of farmers, and yes, even inspected the royal armpits of divine tax collectors. How you're starting to see it. How a civilization built its spine not on grand battles or towering monuments, but on paperwork, patient weighing, and very serious sniffing. Now, as dusk slips into that soft purple hour, you're guided to the temple of Karnak, not to pray, but to pay. Because even the gods, magnificent as they are, expect their dues. Inside, it's dim and cool. Columns rise like petrified forests, every inch etched with divine stories and economic transactions. A priest in linen robes accepts offerings. Fragrant cones of myrrh, trays of honeyed bread, baskets of garlic, tiny alabaster jars of sacred perfume. Some of these were tithed by the people directly. Others arrived via officials, who skimmed just enough the top to avoid suspicion, but not punishment. In a side chamber, you discover one of the most peculiar tax items, a full goose, roasted and stuffed with dates. A sticky note, figuratively speaking, explains, in lieu of annual wheat delivery, approved due to flooding. Historians still argue whether food for grain substitutions like this was standardized policy or a delicious loophole. Either way, the goose smells divine. The priest leans over and shares a sleepy truth. The gods care more that it was given than what it is. Intent matters. You're not sure whether that's theology or tax law, but it's comforting all the same. You follow the trail of offerings deeper into the temple, past rooms where statues are bathed, clothed, and offered perfume. Every morning, like their sacred influencers with a high-maintenance skincare routine, the priests pour oils over stone feet, wave incense toward carved eyes, and anoint altars with lotus extract. Every drop came from somewhere, someone's garden, someone's tax record. Even the lighting, dim and flickering, feels taxed, like fire itself owes a portion of its glow to the state. You're led into an archive room where papyri are stacked neatly in stone cubbies. They tell the long story of what was paid to whom, and why. A scholar says, pulling a scroll from its nook, is a record of an entire village that paid its yearly obligation in milk, mint oil, and barley cakes shaped like Hartha. The cakes were apparently too adorable to eat, and thus were handed directly to the temple staff for a spiritual use. You raise an eyebrow. The priest shrugs. Further down the corridor you find a funerary ledger, a record of taxes paid not by the living, but by those preparing to die. It includes burial perfumes, shrouds, and donated lines. The idea: if your taxes were in order, your journey through the afterlife might be a little smoother. Less snake wrestling, fewer crocodile deities judging your wardrobe. Historians still debate whether these death taxes were mandatory or just a cosmic bribe, but the result is the same: the dead paid in scent and cloth, and the temples kept track. You pause by a mural that shows a procession of villagers bringing goods to the temple gates. Their arms are full: baskets of bread, jugs of bare, woven cloth, painted fans. Some smile, some look annoyed. One man seems to be mid-argument with a goat. Above them in neat hieroglyphs is a phrase that translates loosely as, "That which is owed shall be given. That which is given shall echo forever." It's not a bad tax philosophy, all things considered. You leave the temple as night settles in, stars appearing in a velvet sky that looks hand-painted by Ra's quieter cousin. Your sandals scuff softly across stone as you reflect on what it all meant. Taxes, in ancient Egypt, weren't just about extracting wealth. They were a language, a rhythm, a way to structure the chaos of flood and sun and grain and time. And what did you pay with? Bread that fed workers, perfume that pleased gods, beer that soothed back-breaking days in the fields. Your taxes weren't coins. They were moments, shared between you and the divine, scribbled onto papyrus by tired men who sometimes doodled cats in the margins. It turns out, the kingdom didn't just run on gold and grain. It ran on the belief that order must be maintained, even if that meant counting onions, even if that meant debating whether camel sweat counts as taxable moisture. It doesn't, allegedly, and as the wind picks up, curling like incense around the temple's outer walls, you understand that paying in perfume and bread was never just transactional. It was participatory, sacred, silly at times, but always, always, meant to remind you that you were part of something bigger. So now, just lie back and let it all drift away. The scent of ancient perfume still lingers faintly in your imagination. Something floral, maybe a little spicy, with hints of myrrh and warm desert wind. You can almost feel the soft grain of a woven linen robe brushing against your skin. Hear the low murmur of temple prayers echoing off sandstone walls. The marketplace noise has faded, the tax ledgers are closed, and the Nile flows on without hurry as it always has. You picture a loaf of honey bread, fresh and warm, left gently on an altar as an offering. Not because you had to, but because that's just what you do when the world feels big and the gods feel close. Even now, the simplicity of that gesture feels grounding, like paying attention, like showing up. Let your breathing follow the slow rhythm of that eternal river. Long, easy inhales, and even slower exhales. The sun is long gone behind the dunes, and the stars are rising with a softness that pulls at your eyelids. You've wandered far tonight through grain fields and papyrus scrolls, perfume workshops and granaries, gossiping households and humming temples, and you made it through. Sunburnt, bread-fed, mildly confused by goose-related taxation. But you made it. Nothing's required of you now. You've already given your due. So let your body grow heavy, warm and still. Let the sand settle, let the night deepen. Let your thoughts unspool like a papyrus roll in gentle hands. The ancient world will be here in the morning. But for now, just rest.